Thank you all for being here. This morning, the committee meets to consider the nomination of Mr. Elbridge Colby to be Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I want to thank Mr. Colby for his willingness to serve again. I want to thank his wife, Susanna, and their children for being here today. It also says a lot that Mr. Colby will be introduced today by two distinguished friends, Vice President J.D. Vance and Senator Banks. We are informed that the Vice President is in traffic, and so after consulting to my right and left, we will proceed again because there are time constraints. And when the Vice President arrives, I think he'll be arriving just in time. So proceeding on, if confirmed, Mr. Colby would oversee the developments of policy and strategy for the Department of Defense. He would assume these responsibilities during the most dangerous security environment since World War II. The deepening military cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea represents a complex and far-reaching set of threats. These threats demand a generational investment to revitalize America's military strength. They demand rapid Pentagon reform, and they demand a fresh look at strategies needed to achieve our national security objectives. The American people need to understand what is at stake. We should help the country appreciate the risks imposed to our way of life. Beijing is leading an emerging alliance of countries with one clear objective: to use their economic and military power to tear down the United States and impose their will on global affairs. The new axis of aggressors is a greater menace than we have faced in decades. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, the Chinese Communist Party has undertaken one of the largest and most aggressive military buildups in history. Their speed has been astounding. In just a few short years, China has built more nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles than the U.S. has in decades. They have tested orbital bombardment weapons and unveiled what may be the world's first sixth-generation fighter aircraft. China possesses a shipbuilding capacity over 230 times that of the United States. Over 230 times. That's almost inconceivable. Over 3 years ago, Vladimir Putin launched the first invasion of a European country since World War II. He has barraged the Ukrainian people with constant missile and drone attacks. The Kremlin has developed a variety of new weapons capabilities, including nuclear-armed satellites. Meanwhile, Russia actively provides enriched uranium to China to support Beijing's nuclear buildup. Putin has also been suspected of aiding North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Moving on to North Korea, the nuclear arsenal there continues to advance unchecked. Kim Jong-un has been aiding Russia's war machine as it terrorizes Europe. Pyongyang's missiles could soon be capable of overwhelming our defenses, North Korea's, especially if reports of Russian assistance are accurate. In the Middle East, Israel has successfully crippled Iran's proxies in the region, but these setbacks may spur Tehran to take the final step to build a nuclear weapon, permanently altering the balance of power in that region. Few really understand how this axis of aggressors is working to make Americans less safe. If confirmed, I hope Mr. Colby can help Secretary Hegseth as he makes sure the public sees these threats for what they are. During Secretary Hegseth's hearing, I spoke about the importance of building a motivated and highly competent team of professionals at the Pentagon. In this regard, Mr. Colby is certainly qualified for the role to which President Trump has nominated him. For more than 2 decades, he has worked on defense policy. Mr. Colby previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. In that role, Mr. Colby played a pivotal role in the formulation of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the first real strategy in years. His leadership was crucial in helping the United States articulate the need for a new defense posture, one focused on strategic competition with China and Russia and the overdue modernization of our military. Mr. Colby and I have been ringing the same bell on military unpreparedness for years, particularly as it relates to China. This committee would echo exhortations on defense policy in the Western Pacific. We should make Taiwan a porcupine, and Taipei is sprinting in that direction. We should build a larger U.S. military footprint in East Asia, and we should accelerate the most important weapons programs to deter China. President Trump has made it clear that he intends to rebuild the military and reform the Pentagon. He campaigned on peace through strength. We all want to keep America safe and prosperous. To secure that peace will enable a golden age for America. But we do not now have the strength that can guarantee us the peace. Given the threat environment facing us, I strongly believe that we cannot simply pivot our attention and resources from one threat to another. That is an approach the Obama administration tried, and it did fail. We must be focused and strategic. But we need to be clear. Beijing sees its fight against America as a global fight. Beijing is not pivoting between theaters or among theaters. Significant American withdrawal in Europe, Africa, South America, or the Middle East will allow the Chinese Communist Party to overcome us strategically, even if we are able to prevent military conflict in East Asia in the near term. In the past few weeks, President Trump has killed 5 top al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists. Good for him. He's greenlit more aggressive campaign against the Houthis and promised to support Israel to the hilt. All these policies are in line with the president's desire for lasting peace and prosperity in the United States. And Mr. Colby, I'm sure that is your desire too. Now, Mr. Colby, your views on each theater have seemingly evolved since 2018, and I'm sure there'll be discussions about that are worth exploring. It goes without saying that the elephant in this hearing room today is the recent developments with regard to Ukraine and Russia and this administration. I was disappointed and dismayed as I watched the televised meeting involving the President of the United States and President Zelensky. And I was distressed that the White House meeting ended without the signing of the minerals agreement, which was there to be signed, as I understand it. This was followed by a television appearance by President Zelensky, and then a visit to some of our friends in Europe, where there's much concern about the failure of that agreement to be signed. It was also followed that weekend by Mr. Putin's continued barrage of attacking apartments, civilian targets, and other areas in Ukraine. Not a good weekend for peace in Ukraine or world peace. The president's trying to get a peace deal in Ukraine, and I certainly hope we'll be able to get this back on the rails. I would like to hear your views on the potential there. Your views on President Trump's crystal clear Iran policy seem to have hardened considerably. Yet your views on Taiwan's importance to the United States seems to have softened considerably. I hope we can clarify those views today. And your views on the relevance of nuclear weapons in the next decade remain unclear to me. I would appreciate your comments on each of those issues. Mr. Colby, you've spoken frequently to audiences who are skeptical of the idea that U.S. peace and prosperity require us to wield U.S. power abroad. I'm grateful that you have led those discussions that U.S. foreign policy professionals do not like having. I expect your points on the limits of U.S. power remain nuanced and complementary to the president's peace through strength agenda. and it will be crystal clear that you will speak for the president in this regard. If you're focused on finding innovative ways to blend America's comparative advantages in this global fight against Chinese communists, I strongly believe you will be a boon to the president and to the United States of America. I would like to hear your strategic vision for the next 4 years. I'd like to hear your comments on the plans I have released for rebuilding and reforming the military. In confirming Secretary Hegseth, we charged him with focusing on 4 guiding principles as he assumed office: lethality, efficiency, speed, and accountability. I also appreciate the easy access that he and I have had in conversations with each other since his confirmation. As Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I'd like to know how you plan to execute in these 4 areas to support President Trump's peace through strength agenda. So thank you very much for being here. We look forward to your testimony, and I now recognize Ranking Member Reed for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, congratulations on your nomination and welcome to today's hearing. I would also like to recognize your wife, Susanna, and sons Orlando and Thomas, and your parents, siblings, and family members with us today. I would also, in anticipation of his arrival, like to welcome the Vice President and certainly my colleague, Senator Banks. Thank you. Mr. Colby, you have been nominated to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, or the USDP. The USDP serves as a principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense and plays a critical role in developing long-term strategic policies of the department. If confirmed, you would lead defense policy at a consequential time. There is a common understanding that the future of our national security is tied significantly to our competition with China. This competition is occurring across every field of national power: military, economic, political, technological, and more, and across every region of the world. Mr. Colby, as you have written extensively, America's success in this competition will depend on our credibility in the eyes of our allies and our adversaries. If our allies in the Indo-Pacific perceive us to be untrustworthy or unreliable, they will hesitate to stand with us when we need them. And if China believes that we can be worn down through cajoling or bullying, they will take bold risks. And I'm deeply concerned that the Trump administration is surrendering our credibility at this very moment. For 3 years, the United States has stood with Ukraine and with our NATO allies in the face of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked bloody assault on Ukraine. Indeed, for the better part of a century, we have stood against Russia's aggression and been the global standard-bearer of democracy. But now, after barely a month in office, President Trump has attacked this legacy and signaled he would rather align with the United States with Vladimir Putin than our democratic allies. Make no mistake, China is watching. We should be proud that the United States has led a formidable group of nations to support Ukraine and defend democracy on the world stage. However, President Trump seems eager to strike a deal with Vladimir Putin at any cost, even conceding our most valuable points of leverage before reaching the negotiating table. His recent claim that Ukraine, not Russia, started this war is offensive, and his attacks against President Zelensky are badly misguided. Frankly, the spectacle in the Oval Office last week was a failure of American leadership. President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine are fighting for their very lives, and to suggest that they are ungrateful for American aid is absurd. Many of my colleagues and I, including those here today, have traveled to Ukraine many times and seen firsthand the death and destruction wrought by Vladimir Putin against innocent people. To deride Ukraine and our allies is a mistake that only benefits Putin. Just last night, President Trump cut off all military aid to Ukraine. Make no mistake, his callous decision will only endanger innocent Ukrainians and encourage Russia to escalate its attacks. The United States is paying with money. The Ukrainians are paying with their lives. The administration's actions are doing great harm to America's standing in the world, showing anyone who is paying attention that the United States can no longer be trusted. President Xi is certainly taking notice. Thank you. Mr. Colby, you have argued against U.S. support for Ukraine and called for steep reductions to America's role in Europe. I ask you to explain these views and how, if confirmed, you would work to repair America's standing with our allies, as well as our competitive position with respect to our adversaries. The Department of Defense has long built its strategy around the idea of winning in an armed conflict and deterring China through military dominance. That is no longer enough. The game has changed, and our capacity for outright victory through military strength should not be our only measure of success. The Defense Department needs to better understand China's strategy for increasing its capabilities and influence, including in the so-called gray zone. Below the threshold of traditional armed conflict, we must also develop new tools for competition and integrate our activities with those of our allies and partners. Mr. Colby, you have written and spoken extensively about these concepts. You are a lead author of the 2018 National Defense Strategy and have played an important role in defense policy through your previous positions in the Department and at a number of think tanks. I would ask for your views on how the Department of Defense should pursue competition and deterrence with China, especially as it relates to the United States' relationship with Taiwan and our network of allies in the region. I would also like to know your priorities for the forthcoming round of defense policy reviews, including the next National Defense Strategy. You have also argued that the United States must rigorously prioritize our efforts on great power competition with China to include withdrawing forces from other theaters. I agree that we should be thoughtful and disciplined about how we use the military. That is why I am skeptical of the President's deployment of thousands of troops to the southern border and Guantanamo Bay. Border security and immigration enforcement are critical to our national security, but these current missions are dubious at best. The Department estimates that it will spend $1 billion to $2 billion for unplanned border missions this year, even as illegal migrant encounters are at the lowest level since August of 2020. The Government Accountability Office has assessed these missions in recent years and found, quote, separating units in order to assign a portion of them to the Southwest Border Mission was a consistent trend in degrading readiness ratings. Mr. Colby, I have serious doubts about these missions. I would like to know what role you believe military forces should play in border security and whether the Defense Department should be involved in enforcing immigration policies that fall in the purview of the Department of Homeland Security and are essentially law enforcement operations, which posse comitatus circumscribes dramatically for the military. Finally, you will need to reconcile your views with the current longstanding bipartisan approach of the United States to the Middle East. The region remains extremely unstable after more than a year of violence between Israel, Hamas, Iran, and its proxies, and the fall of the Assad regime. Mr. Colby, you have advocated for a much more limited role in the region and suggested that the U.S. should be willing to tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. I hope you will address your reviews on these issues and how you would work to advance U.S. national security interests in the Middle East. If confirmed, you will lead at a challenging moment. All of our potential adversaries, including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, are seeking ways to undermine our interests and supplant our leadership. I would ask for your plans on how the Department can pursue every available opportunity to advance our national interests. I certainly look forward to your testimony. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And before we proceed, guests and members, including the chair, are sternly admonished to silence all phones and electronic devices. Mr. Vice President, I see that you have arrived and you are next on our list. Thank you very much for joining us this morning to introduce your friend and the nominee, and I now turn to you for your comments. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Wicker, and thanks to the ranking member, Senator Reed, and thanks to all my friends from across the aisle who permit this brief intrusion into what was otherwise, I'm sure, a very distinguished and interesting conversation. But I wanted to be here because I thought it was important to tell you all about my friend Elbridge Colby and why I think he's important to the president's defense policy and important to what the president is trying to accomplish with national security. So first, I think Elbridge, more than any person I've ever spoken to, appreciates that military power, national security influence is downstream of economic power. As we've seen in so many of the conflicts that we've engaged ourselves in over the last 30 or 40 years, we cannot fight wars unless our troops have the ammunition they need. We cannot defend our own national security unless we have the tank shells, the artillery shells, and increasingly the drones and other advanced weapon systems that are necessary to actually fight battles when, God forbid, those battles are necessary to fight. And I think Elbridge has been particularly aware of and worried about the degradation of our defense industrial base and how we must rebuild it if we want to preserve our own national security. I've had many conversations with Elbridge before I was a United States Senator, certainly before I was the Vice President of the United States, where in so many ways Elbridge predicted what we would be talking about 4 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. He saw around corners that very few other people were seeing around. That doesn't mean he's always right about every issue or that you'll agree with him on every issue, and I say that to both the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee, but I think that he's the type of perspective that we need so desperately at the Department of Defense, and I think that his role at the Department of Defense will be incredibly important in seeing around the corners of the next 5 years and the next 10 years, and that's one of the most important reasons why I think we should support his nomination at this great committee, but obviously support his confirmation in the United States Senate. Let me say a couple of other things about Elbridge, and then I'll let you guys get on with the committee hearing. First of all, Elbridge is a person of incredible integrity and intellect. His educational credentials are extraordinary. But to my Democratic friends, I think you also find he's a person who can actually work across the aisle. If you look at his long career in defense policy, he has said things that is, frankly, alienated Democrats and Republicans. He's also said things that I think both Democrats and Republicans would agree with. He obviously is a conservative. He obviously is the nominee of President Trump, and we nominated him because we think he's going to do a great job. But I think you'll find that he's the kind of guy that you can engage in meaningful conversation, whatever your agreement or disagreement with his views is. And again, that's one of the things that we need to bring to the Department of Defense. Elbridge is a good guy. And I said this in the only other confirmation hearing that I actually introduced to guests of Secretary Lutnick. You need good people in government. You need people who are going to tell you the truth, who are going to look you in the eye, who are going to disagree, sometimes amicably, of course, but actually be willing to look you in the eye and have an important conversation, who you can trust to tell you what they actually think, agree or disagree. And that's the kind of person that Elbridge is. He's a great family man. He comes from a life of service, but also a family of service going back many generations. And he's the kind of guy that we need working on policy at the senior levels of the Department of Defense. And of course, that's why the president nominated him. And the final thing that I want to say about Elbridge is so much of this question of rebuilding the industrial base, and I think it's one of the few areas of genuine bipartisan agreement. We may not always agree exactly how to do it, but I think everybody pretty much agrees that we have to build the industrial base in the United States that can support the national security policy of the next generation. Whether you have a Democrat or Republican president 20 years from now, you need to ensure that the troops who are under the command of that commander-in-chief actually have the weapon systems necessary to support themselves and to accomplish the mission. That's not a simple matter of throwing money at the problem. That's not a simple matter of saying we need to buy more weapons. It also goes deeply into questions of procurement. How are we buying those weapons? How are we engaging with the technologists of the 21st century? Because we're never going to beat China in a war of population. They have, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and we've got just north of 300 million. But what we can do is actually have the kind of technology that gives our troops and gives our people the advantage over the long haul. And that means not just buying more weapons, that means being smart about how we buy weapons in a way that enhances our technological edge and ensures that upstarts, not just the big five incumbents, but upstarts can participate in the process of procurement and of giving our troops the weapon systems that they need. So I think that we need to think deeply about these questions. I think that President Trump and the Department of Defense, Secretary Hegseth on down, are thinking deeply about these questions. Elbridge Colby is an important part, not just of thinking about these questions, but also accomplishing important policy. And so with all respect to all of you and knowing that all of you will make up your own minds, I highly encourage you to give Elbridge Colby your stamp of approval. He's a good guy, he's a smart guy, and he'll do a good job for the United States of America. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Vice President. We appreciate you being here, and I know you're busy, but we certainly would be delighted to have you stay around. Thank you so much. Senator Banks.
Thank you, Mr.
Can you
Chairman.
top that?
It's hard to follow our good friend.
You're
but
recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, fellow members of the most important committee in the entire Congress, the Senate Armed Services Committee. It's good to be with all of you today to introduce my friend, Elbridge Colby, the President's choice to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon. I've known Elbridge Colby, or Bridge, for a very long time. I got to know him in the first Trump term, but he became an advisor to me when I served on the House Armed Services Committee. And even more importantly, he became deeply involved in the Republican Study Committee that I chaired, the largest caucus on Capitol Hill in the House, helping us to understand the world, how to talk about it, what to do about the complex issues around the world. The threats that we face around the world are increasingly sophisticated, but I'm confident that with Bridge in charge of developing and implementing our defense strategy, America will be wholly prepared. Bridge already knows his way around the Pentagon from his time as a senior official in OSD policy in the first Trump term, the very office, by the way, that we're considering his nomination for today. He's eminently qualified for this role. While in OSD, he co-led and was the key architect of the development of President Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy. After 2 decades of prioritizing wars in the Middle East, the National Defense Strategy under Bridge and the first Trump administration rightly refocused the U.S. military on great power competition with China and maintaining American superiority in the Pacific. Bridge has been a leader in courageously stating this truth: America's focus must be on the military threat from communist China, and the U.S. and our allies are running out of time to act on it. Bridge has written numerous reports and articles on foreign policy and defense, as well as his widely studied book, The Strategy of Denial, which I will admit is dry, but incredibly substantive. And I recommend that every member of this committee read his book. I believe his answers to your question today will underline his expertise, his unique qualifications for this role and this position. He will make an excellent Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and I look forward to working with all of you as fellow members of this committee to swiftly confirm his nomination and get him on the job. You won't be disappointed. Mr. Chairman, thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you today.
Thank you very, very much, Senator Banks. And you are welcome to resume your seat or to stay there at the desk. But thank you very much. And again, our thanks to our Vice President. Mr. Colby, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the Armed Services Committee, it is an exceptional personal honor to appear before you today to be considered for the position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I would like to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to President Trump for nominating me for this role. I am committed to implementing his vision of a defense and foreign policy of putting Americans' interests first and of peace through strength. I am deeply honored by the President's confidence in me. Thank you in particular to Vice President Vance for his exceptionally kind introduction and his confidence. I am profoundly honored by his support and presence here today. And thank you very much to Senator Jim Banks for his incredibly generous introduction. I'm deeply honored as well. I would also like to express my great gratitude to Secretary of Defense Hegseth for his support and confidence. I would also like to thank the members of this committee for their consideration. I have very much appreciated my engagement with you and your staffs over the last weeks and have learned a great deal. If confirmed, I would look forward to deepening this engagement. Finally, I would like especially to express my personal thanks to my family for their love and support, especially to my wife, Susanna, and our sons, Orlando and Thomas, seated behind me. I would also like to thank my parents, Jonathan and Susan, as well as other family members and friends present here today, as well as the family and friends who are not here but have supported me in this process and throughout my life and career. Members of this committee, with your permission, I will keep my opening remarks brief. The position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is a role that comes with genuinely profound and grave responsibilities. And my nomination comes at a time, as this committee has eloquently laid out, of deep peril for our country. Peace and the protection of American interests in the world cannot be assumed. There is a real risk of major war, and we cannot afford to lose one. I recognize these realities in my bones. It is my great hope that we can get through the coming years peacefully, with strength, in ways that put us and our alliances on a stronger and more sustainable footing. If confirmed, I would do all in my power to make it so. I know some of you will have different views on important issues, but I can assure you of several things: that I am deeply committed to a foreign and defense policy that realistically protects and advances all Americans' security, freedoms, and prosperity, that I'm willing and ready to engage with those who disagree with me and adapt my views based on persuasive arguments and the facts, that I value our alliances deeply, even as I think they must be adapted, and that I love our great country and will put its interests first and foremost. If confirmed, I pledge to strive with every fiber to meet the grave responsibilities of this important office with judgment, commitment, and determination. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, I am required to ask you a number of questions, which we ask all nominees. So have you adhered to applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I have, Senator.
Have you assumed any duties or taken any actions that would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
I have not, Senator.
Exercising our legislative and oversight responsibilities makes it important that this committee, its subcommittees, and other appropriate committees of Congress receive testimony, briefings, reports, records, and other information from the executive branch on a timely basis. Mr. Colby, do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify before this committee when requested?
I do, Senator.
Do you agree to provide records, documents, and electronic communications in a timely manner when requested by this committee, its subcommittees, or other appropriate committees of Congress, and to consult with the requester regarding the basis for any good faith, delay, or denial on your part in providing such records?
I do, Senator.
Will you ensure that your staff complies with deadlines established by this committee for the production of reports, records, and other information, including timely responding to hearing questions for the record?
I will, Senator.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
I will, Senator.
Will those witnesses and briefers be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They will, Senator.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to begin a round of 5-minute questions. I'm going to a round of questions limited to 5 minutes per member, and I'm going to hold myself as chair to that 5 minutes also. So at this point, let me begin by asking about a couple of policy advisors that are already in place. One of your advisors, if confirmed, would be Mr. Michael Domino. You did not choose Mr. Domino for that.
Senator, no, I was not the hiring person.
He said recently there are no vital, quote, there are no vital or existential U.S. interest in the Middle East, unquote. Mr. Colby, to your understanding, does that reflect the president's policy in the Middle East?
Senator, I think that the president has made clear that we do have really important interests in the Middle East.
Does Mr. Domino's policy pronouncement reflect your own views?
Senator, no, I wouldn't. He does not speak for me, and I think I have a number of views that differ materially from his, from what I understand, just in public reporting.
Another policy advisor is Mr. Andrew Byers. He's an advisor on Southeast Asia. He believes that thinking about communist China through the lens of deterrence is wrong. He thinks maybe we should give up what he calls, quote, belligerent policies toward China and see if they will reciprocate. He apparently thinks pressing Beijing on trade is a bad idea. So, Mr. Colby, does that reflect the President's policy, our President Trump's policy on China, in your view?
It does not, Senator, and I would say that it does not reflect mine. I mean, as I think Senator Banks and the Vice President kindly mentioned, I wrote a book really focused on the lens of deterrence. And of course, as the Vice President, I think, rightly mentioned, we also need to be thinking about the economic dimension. And of course, the administration's already taking measures in that direction. So I have it seems, again, I'm not intimately familiar with his work, but it seems like a quite different perspective than my own.
And I do understand that you've made no determination as to whether Mr. Domino and or Mr. Byers will be retained in those positions.
Sir, as part of not presuming, my understanding is that I should not be even sort of thinking in that way. Senator, what I would say is that if confirmed, obviously I would be only one person in a chain, including, of course, the Secretary of Defense, the Presidential Personnel Office, and ultimately the President, the Vice President, and so forth. But what I would commit to you is that anybody in my organization, if I'm confirmed, should be in line with the President's agenda, including the issues that you mentioned.
Very well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I have appreciated what I view as your clear articulation of the core U.S. interest in Taiwan, which are too infrequently discussed in the public here in America. As you wrote in American Compass last year, quote, "Nothing that could happen abroad is more plausibly and gravely threatening to Americans than China invading Taiwan." Unquote. Your 2022 article at Stanford has about as good a one-paragraph summary of our interest in Taiwan as I've seen. Yet in November of last year, some people believe your position may have taken a marked turn as you wrote, quote, "America has a strong interest in defending Taiwan, but Americans could survive without it." So, Mr. Colby, I'll let you respond to that, but specifically, can the United States enjoy a golden age for America with increasing prosperity for our citizens in this century if we fail to deter China in Taiwan, or worse yet, lose that war?
Well, thanks, Senator. Losing Taiwan's fall would be a disaster for American interests. The underlying logic behind my position is that the military balance vis-a-vis China, as you, sir, and your committee members, fellow committee members have amply and eloquently pointed out, has deteriorated dramatically. What I have been trying to shoot a signal flare over is that it is vital for us to focus and enable our own forces for an effective and reasonable defense of Taiwan, and for the Taiwanese as well as the Japanese to do more. So my position in terms of the value of Taiwan is consistent, but what I'm very fearful of, Senator, and I think this is agreed across administrations of both parties, is that, you know, the military balance has declined. So what I'm trying to avoid a situation in which, because we are not adequately prepared, we get in a situation, the analogy I like to use is Winston Churchill in 1940 wanting to send Spitfires and Hurricanes to the Battle of France, but Marshal doubting, saying, if we do that, we're not going to be prepared to be able to defend the home islands. That's a sort of an extreme example, but that's what I'm trying to avoid.
How soon will it take us to get prepared?
It would be essentially my number one, or one of my very top priorities, if confirmed, to try to get us prepared as quickly as possible, and then over the medium and longer term as well, Senator.
And you and I are absolutely united on that.
Great.
Thank you very much, Chairman Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Colby, you've advocated a reduction in support for Ukraine, which you characterize as a distraction from Taiwan. Yet former CIA Director Bill Burns, one of the most astute commentators about Russia, former ambassador, CIA Director, stated that no one is watching U.S. support for Ukraine more closely than Chinese leaders. And, quote, "one of the surest ways to rekindle Chinese perceptions of American fecklessness and stoke Chinese aggressiveness would be to abandon support for Ukraine. So what message are the President's actions sending?
Well, Senator, I'd say a couple things. One, my arguments about Ukraine have been based on the need for strategic prioritization. I don't contest the fact that the Chinese are looking at what we're doing in Ukraine at all. But fundamentally, Senator, my view, and I think it should be of particular interest to this committee, sir, is that we have to have the military capabilities in Asia or relevant to Asia to be able to conduct a local defense of Taiwan at a cost and level of risk that the American people are prepared to tolerate. And that has been my main focus. My aspiration, if I would put another, and to kind of build on what the Vice President was saying, a longer term top priority for me would be, if confirmed, would be to revivify our defense industrial base so that we are no longer in a position where our defense industrial base cannot produce at levels where we can resource in multiple theaters at the level that we need. That's where we want to get back to.
Well, I don't think there's a dispute about reinvigorating the industrial base. I think, though, there is, from astute personalities like Bill Burns, the fear that we're sending dramatically the wrong lesson. Indeed, on December 2023, you stated, quote, "The invasion of Ukraine is an evil act by the Russians, and I morally support the Ukrainian defense." Do you still agree with that statement?
Senator, I think I stand by my record, but at this point, I think there's a very delicate diplomatic process going on where the President is rightfully trying to resuscitate the peace process, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me to weigh in on the specific case.
The President declared, indicated the Russians invaded Ukraine, which is completely erroneous, and that Zelensky is a dictator, which is, I think, also erroneous. And, you know, we're in an awkward situation now. He's cutting every sort of tool we have, and that's not the way to negotiate. I don't think that was in the art of the deal. So I think we're in a very serious situation. Let me change topics for a moment. General Mattis, who I respect immensely as former Secretary of Defense and as a Marine, stated, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition," which raises the question of the wisdom of eviscerating the USAID. In many places in the world, and you know this, that's the only American presence. That's the counterpoint to Chinese incursions all across the globe. And now we've put them out of business. And it's been indicated that this will cause millions of unnecessary deaths, particularly of children and women. And it seems to be undercutting our power in the world, our soft power. Your thoughts?
Well, Senator, I think it's certainly very important to have an effective and efficient diplomatic arm, the State Department, as well as a development arm, and I would certainly support that. Would not be within my purview, obviously, a number of the issues that you're raising, if confirmed. But I certainly support a tight interaction and integration with the other arms of national power, especially in an era, as we said in Secretary Mattis's defense strategy, where we are no longer in a kind of unipolar militarily dominant situation.
With respect to NATO, I mean, one of the fallouts from our Ukrainian decisions over the last few days is that our European allies feel essentially abandoned, that the NATO alliance is as fragile as it's ever been. And as we all recognize, NATO was the key for the last, since 1949, to our ability to stabilize the world and to promote a democratic and economic agenda that favored the West, and that's in danger now. The President, in his last term, was insisting on 2% for everybody at NATO. Now it's more, almost like a landlord saying, "I'm raising the rent unless you do something, something, something." Do you believe the NATO alliance has made us stronger and that if it's jeopardized, we will be in serious trouble?
Senator, I believe that the NATO alliance has been an exceptionally successful alliance, but I think if we're going to sustain it, it needs to move in the direction that President Trump is leading it in, and where I think the Europeans are finally moving. If you look at Chancellor Merz, who's coming in Germany, or President Macron, or Prime Minister Starmer, they're not only spending more. 2% is manifestly inadequate. General Cavoli has said that. Many others have said that. They need to see real combat capabilities. The conversation has materially improved in recent months and over the last few years, where we can get NATO into a more balanced fashion. And Senator, I believe that that's much more consistent with the model of NATO that existed during the Cold War, rather than the post-Cold War model, which is too heavily lopsided in American responsibility, and it needs to change to be sustained.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colby. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Mr. Colby, welcome. Welcome to you and your family and friends. In your answers to the committee's advanced policy questions, you stated that, quote, U.S. nuclear forces underpin our entire deterrence and defense posture, end quote, and that, quote, ensuring we retain a modern, capable, and effective nuclear deterrent should be our top priority, end quote. I agree with those statements. Nuclear deterrence must be the foundation for any defense strategy. However, this foundation is threatened because of decades of underinvestment and poor management. I'm confident this administration can correct the course of our modernization programs, both through adequate resourcing and by approving our acquisition strategies for Sentinel, Columbia, and B-21. Mr. Colby, if confirmed, will you commit to working with this committee to fully modernize all aspects of our nuclear triad and continuing the work of the first Trump administration to rebuild our nation's most important military capabilities?
I do, Senator.
Thank you. Russia has nearly completed their modernization of all of their nuclear forces, and China's modernizing, and they're growing their arsenal at a breathtaking speed. Yet the combination of an industrial base that we continually worry about in this country and overly complicated acquisition policies, it holds us back from keeping pace. You've talked about that. The Vice President talked about that in his introduction to you as well. If confirmed, what policies would you recommend to increase the overall capacity of that industrial base?
Well, Senator, I think actually a number of the things that the Vice President has spoken about and the President, which is that a broader reindustrialization, in my view, is necessary to fix a lot of the defense industrial base issues, not just with the nuclear forces, as critical as they are, but also with the broader conventional forces as well, which is to say, and I know this committee has drawn attention to this problem, that despite the investment in money, often the results are less than people would like to see, for instance, because of workforce issues. So if confirmed, I wouldn't approach the problem with saying I have all of the particular policy ideas set and I'm going to, in terms of improving the industrial production. But what I would see my role as making very clear that revamping and restoring a really healthy and robust defense industrial base is absolutely a national priority. And what I've said as a private commentator, but I believe as a public official, if confirmed, is that we kind of need a national mobilization of our defense industrial base. We need to be able to get better results, and it seems to me that's something that could get wide agreement.
Do you have in mind any acquisition policies that you would revamp at this point in time, that you would recommend changing or even eliminating?
Senator, at this point, I wouldn't have any specific ones. I know a lot of those would be under the purview of the Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition and other, the service secretaries and so forth. I would be delighted to dive into that issue further and give you a more concrete answer. But again, I would see my role, if confirmed, as the USDP to kind of drive the overall strategic direction that we need to get better results out of our defense industrial base.
Should we utilize the Defense Production Act in
I think
order to move
that
forward?
absolutely would make sense. And deregulation in general at that level, I think all options should be on the table, including things that seem pretty dramatic, because I think, as the chairman rightly said, we live in a very dramatic situation and world.
The department's also modernizing our NC3, and that's what the Strategic Forces Subcommittee calls the fourth leg of our triad. If confirmed, will you ensure that this effort receives the necessary attention and the resources that it needs?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Would you prioritize it as one of, along with our triad, as the top priority of the department?
Certainly. I mean, I think command and control is absolutely essential, and when we're living in a world of much more capable cyber capabilities, not to mention missile threats, not just the traditional strategic strike threats, but also a range of different threats that are evolving very quickly, we have to absolutely pay really critical attention to NC3.
Thank you, Mr. Colby.
Thank you.
Senator Gillibrand, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for appearing here. Thank you for bringing your family. This is a very significant role you are undertaking that takes enormous amounts of responsibility and thoughtful judgment. I want to talk about the threats we are facing from around the globe. We've continued to see cyber threats from Russia. We had SolarWinds. We had the Colonial Pipeline compromise. We had the 2016 effort to undermine our electoral infrastructure. It was reported last week that Secretary Hegseth ordered a halt on Cybercom's offensive operations against Russia. We have not heard anything from Russia that they are similarly disarming. What advice will you give to President Trump with regard to how to keep the United States safe from Russian attacks through cyber and other means?
Senator, I haven't seen the actual documents, so I only have what I'm going on based on public reporting, but my recommendation would be that we should maintain the highest level of cyber vigilance and capability vis-a-vis Russia as well as others like China.
Would you unilaterally disarm and not use offensive operations?
Senator, I don't know exactly what's going on. I couldn't comment about what's going on, but generally I think these reciprocal steps in the sort of logic of arms control, steps should be reciprocated credibly.
Correct. Would you consider Russia to be postured as an adversary or as an ally?
I think we need, from a military point of view, from a defense point of view, Senator, as I put in my responses to the advanced policy questions, Russia presents a significant military threat to Europe, and there are significant military threats to the homeland as well. And I think from a defense point of view, we need to regard that in a very clear-eyed way. At the same time, as an overall strategy, I think that can support and be compatible with an effort to diminish, the potential for direct confrontation with Russia in the same way with China as well.
Who started the war in Ukraine?
Senator, as I said earlier, I think this is a very delicate diplomatic time. I've spoken about this in the past. I would hate to be in a situation of disrupting or inhibiting progress on peace. I think the President and the Vice President have been very clear that words matter, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to be commenting on these delicate topics.
Given that you won't make a public statement with regard to it, will you tell this committee that you will advise President Trump on the truth of all matters?
Well, Senator, I absolutely would commit to you that I would tell the truth in the conduct of my duties.
With regard to China, you are aware of Volt Typhoon, you are aware of Salt Typhoon, you are aware of Flax Typhoon. Do you agree that China poses a cyber threat to the United States and has pre-positioned cyber threats around the United States to be able to use them should and when it needs to in any conflict with regard to Taiwan?
Senator, I should say that my information is based on public reporting, but based on what you're saying, that is consistent with my understanding, and so I would agree with your assessment.
What advice will you give to President Trump with regard to how to posture appropriately to protect against incursions by China to the United States' national security?
Well, Senator, this is something that I would want to dive much more deeply in, as cyber is obviously an area where a lot of the information is classified, and I haven't had access to that in some time, certainly not on the cyber issue. What I would say, Senator, and I talked about this in my responses to the advanced policy questions, is I would bring my background in the area of deterrence and these kinds of areas, denial and so forth, to bring an integrated approach that includes things like resilience, defenses, but also cyber offensive operations and capabilities, intelligence gathering, and so forth. And my understanding is there has been good work on this in previous years that can be built on, but there could be some sensible policy changes that are on the table that could be worth taking. Again, I don't know enough to say specifically, though, Senator.
I'd be interested in what sensible policy changes you're interested in. I'm highly concerned that should China decide to invade Taiwan, that we haven't done enough cyber defense domestically to prevent the type of chaos that these types of attacks have already created, whether it's Salt Typhoon or Volt Typhoon or Flax Typhoon. Every single one of them is designed to create enormous chaos and instability and would create decision-making that would be, at a minimum, challenging and chaotic.
Senator, I fully share your concerns based on what I'm seeing. Not only would it cause chaos, but it could specifically inhibit or break down U.S. military operations. So I share your alarm. I just don't. I'm not read into a lot of the real specifics.
So I'd like to work with you on what your plan will be for cybersecurity for both incursions from Russia, from China going forward. And in my last 8 minutes, can you just speak briefly about your view with regard to Iran and the threat they pose to the United States and our allies?
I'd welcome working with you on cyber. Just briefly, I will say that Iran does pose a very severe threat to the United States and our allies, especially our key ally, Israel. I think I'll have a chance to elaborate on that given the time situation.
Thank you very much. Senator Cotton.
Mr. Colby, welcome. Let's talk about the threat of a nuclear Iran. I have some concerns about what you've said in the past, namely that if we had to choose between hoping to contain a nuclear Iran and preventing Iran with military force from getting nukes, that we should tolerate a nuclear Iran and try to contain it. For instance, you've written that, quote, containing a nuclear Iran is eminently plausible and practical objective. You've approvingly cited the view that, quote, the only thing worse than the prospect of an Iran armed with nuclear weapons would be the consequences of using force to try to stop them. That's certainly not my view, but more important, it's not President Trump's policy. He has said for more than a decade that Iran cannot be allowed to get nuclear weapons. He declared in a national security presidential memorandum last month that a nuclear Iran, quote, poses an existential danger to the United States and can never be allowed to acquire or develop nuclear weapons. In your written answers to the committee's advanced questions, you now seem to echo President Trump's policy. You wrote, for example, the United States should deny Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon. So it seems that we all agree that Iran cannot be allowed to get nukes. The question is how to stop them. Let me be clear up front on a couple points. First, I think everyone would welcome a diplomatic deal in which Iran completely turns over its nuclear program, as Libya did in 2003. And second, I don't think anyone here advocates for invading and occupying Iran for a decade to stop its nuclear program. I certainly don't. But here's the question. Diplomacy fails. Iran is racing to a bomb. We have a choice. Tolerate a nuclear Iran and hope to contain it. Use military force to stop Iran from going nuclear. In that case, will you commit to providing the President with credible, realistic military options to stop Iran from going nuclear?
I do commit to that, Senator.
And to be more precise, those credible and realistic options are more than simply saying we can give Israel some bombs and they can take care of it.
Yes, I agree with you, Senator.
It's well known that Israel lacks certain military capabilities that we have, such as aerial refueling tankers and heavy bombers with deep penetrating ordnance. Do you believe that at least one option for the President to consider how to stop Iran from going nuclear should be to use our tankers and our bombers, whether in tandem with Israel or in the lead?
Senator, I wouldn't want to get ahead of the President on specific decisions, but I think those are the kinds of things that should be absolutely part of this, the discussion. And if I were confirmed, those would certainly be the kinds of things that I would raise for the consideration of the Secretary and ultimately the President.
Thank you. And to be clear about why this is so important to us, to the United States, not just to Israel or our Arab friends, why President Trump says Iran, a nuclear Iran, is an existential danger to us. You agree that it's an existential danger, not just a severe danger, as you said in response to Senator Gillibrand, or a significant one, as you said in your written answers.
Yes, a nuclear armed Iran, especially, Senator, given that they, as we've discussed, that they've looked into, or we know they've worked on ICBM range capabilities and other kinds of capabilities that would pose an existential danger to the United States.
So they have a space launch program, which is flimsy cover for an intercontinental missile program that could be used to hit us here in Washington, in Little Rock, or elsewhere in the continental United States. It is an immediate threat to Israel and our Arab friends, but it is a threat in the not-too-distant future, probably in just a couple of years, to the United States.
Senator, I don't have access to the intelligence information, but that sounds very consistent to me.
And do you agree that providing President Trump with those credible military options is actually one way to increase leverage to have an airtight diplomatic deal?
Yes, I do agree.
That a lack of military options would make it harder to get a deal?
I do.
Thank you. I want to turn briefly to Taiwan. You have said here today and in your past writings that Taiwan is a critical matter for us. You wrote in 2016 that you thought we should give explicit security guarantees to Taiwan, reversing a decades-old policy of strategic ambiguity. You opined in the same way in 2020 in response to a hearing in the House of Representatives. Over the past couple years, you've started to say, as Senator Wicker pointed out earlier, that Taiwan is a vital interest, but it's not existential interest to us, or it's not essential to us. It seems that you have changed your thoughts somewhat in the last couple years. That is not, I suspect, because of Taiwan's defense spending, which, though still inadequate, I agree, has been trending upward for 7 straight years. So could you explain to us why in the last few years your views seem to have softened somewhat about the defense of Taiwan?
Absolutely, Senator. I've always said that Taiwan is very important to the United States, but as you said, it's not an existential interest. It's very important. The core American interest is in denying China regional hegemony. What's changed, Senator, as we discussed, is the dramatic deterioration of the military balance. So if I could use the Churchill example again, it's different to engage in a futile and overly costly effort that would destroy our military. And I know you've written very eloquently about this danger in your recent book. And the other point that I would say, Senator, is that I believe that we actually have implicitly our relationship and our commitment to Taiwan is largely implicit or indirect or customary. We actually have specified our commitment through things like the designation of Taiwan as the pacing scenario for the department. So my view that the combination of the greater threat from China and the lack of preparedness on our part, I have a different assessment with respect, Senator, about Taiwan's efforts. I think actually as a proportion of GDP, it's well below 3%. I agree with President Trump that they should be more like 10%, or at least something in that ballpark, really focused on their defense. So we need to properly incentivize them. So together, that means that my focus has been, again, with the shooting the flare metaphor I used earlier, Senator, to get Taiwan motivated, to avoid precipitating a conflict that is not necessary with Beijing, and giving us time and space to be able to try to rectify this problem, because that is my goal, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Blumenthal. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Colby, to you and your family. I asked the following 2 initial questions with relevance to fitness to serve. So I'll ask you, since you became a legal adult, have you ever made unwanted requests for sexual favors or committed any verbal or physical harassment or assault of a sexual nature?
I have not, Senator.
Have you ever faced discipline or entered into a settlement relating to this kind of conduct?
I have not, Senator.
I think it's interesting that you would not say whether Russia invaded Ukraine, and that saying that this is a complicated kind of a situation right now. But I think I also heard you say that you would give the president your best advice regardless of what you think he might want to hear. So I'm going to ask you a simple question. Relating to whether Russian military forces invaded Ukraine. In February 2022, did Russian forces cross the border and invade Ukraine, yes or no?
Well, Senator, you're describing a factual reality that is demonstrably true.
Yes, so that would mean that Russia invaded Ukraine. So that was a question that you would not answer. I think that's pretty important, because if we care about what Xi Jinping thinks about what this president does and thinks, and if Xi Jinping thinks that we have a president who does not separate fact from fiction, such as who invaded Ukraine, I would think that maybe President Xi has conclusions that he would draw, maybe having to do with, as our ranking member said, U.S. fecklessness. And I also think that one of the reasons that our NATO allies are increasing their spending on military is that they do not think that they have a particularly stable partner in the U.S., and therefore they better look to their own interests, because they can no longer rely on the U.S. I think that is a very bad situation for the United States to be in, especially as we identify China as a pacing threat, and also whatever Russia is thinking along these lines, clearly they think that they now have a friend in the president. I don't think that helps us vis-a-vis our strength regarding Russia, regarding China. In fact, I think that we are placing ourselves in a very weakened position with regard to how we are viewed by our adversaries, that would be China as well as Russia, and our allies alike. Not a good situation to be in. We need a president who can separate fact from fiction. Let me move on. Since the administration has identified China as a pacing threat and the importance of Indo-PACOM to face that threat, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think the department has identified China as the pacing
So,
threat, as I understand your
but
situation.
Indo-PACOM provided Congress with an $11 billion unfunded priorities list. And this says to me that there is a misalignment of our funding decisions and strategy if we consider Indo-PACOM to be a priority, and yet you have Indo-PACOM putting forward an $11 billion unfunded priorities. What would you do to decrease the unfunded priorities and align our strategy and the importance of Indo-PACOM with the resources that it gets? And would you agree that maybe we should provide Indo-PACOM with more direct input into the department's budgeting and resourcing priorities?
Well, Senator, what I'd like to say
Process.
is, if I may, is I think this is exactly the kind of baseline reality that I think so much of my strategic argumentation proceeds from. A lot of what I'm saying is that, you know, many of us in the public debate and so forth are acting as if you know, we can do everything, but the reality is that there's an $11 billion unfunded priority list from Indo-PACOM, and realistically, I bet the real deficit is even higher, given that that's just what came out. So, Senator, if confirmed, I would make it an absolute priority, given the priority that China must get across administrations. I think this is now a matter of strategic consensus to try to not only drive that down, but to reform the department and reprioritize it, to actually go through and carry out the strategic shift that's been talked about in some ways since probably Bob Work was Deputy Secretary of Defense at the end of the Obama administration.
So would you agree that Indo-PACOM, that command should be provided with more direct input into the department's budgeting and resourcing process?
Senator, I don't have enough information to say specifically organizationally where I would fall on that, but certainly that perspective needs to get, I would say, an elevated.
I hope so, because an $11 billion unfunded priority, that is the largest unfunded priority list of any of our combatant commands. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you. And let me observe, Mr. Colby, that I have been somewhat critical of the COCOMs that have not come forward with realistic unfunded requirements. And so I appreciate the exchange which you and Senator Hirono just had. Our next member is Senator Rounds. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, first of all, I really appreciated the time that I spent with you in my office. I appreciated your comments and thoughts. And to your family, thank you for allowing him to participate in this. It's going to mean a lot of time away, but it's the right thing to do. Mr. Colby, there's always an opportunity to look ahead and to see long-term what our needs are going to be in this country, particularly with the defense of our nation. And now that we recognize 5 different domains, air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, we also recognize that new ways of defending our country are needed as well. Space-based assets are one of those in which, as the President's indicated, he would love to have a golden dome over our country or over the communities within our country. I don't think that's far-fetched. And in fact, I think it's something that we've really got to consider. Today, we have systems along our coastlines that protect many of our cities. Hawaii, as an example, is protected with destroyers that have radar capabilities and so forth. If the President were to be successful in creating an Iron Dome or a Golden Dome, he not only needs space-based assets, but he also needs land-based assets as well that require the use of certain parts of the spectrum for radar purposes. This committee would be shocked if I didn't bring this up with someone in front of us today that's going to have something to say about the use of the spectrum in the future. We talked about this in my office. Forcing the Department of Defense, as some people have suggested, to vacate any portion of the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band of the spectrum would have severe consequences on our warfighting capabilities, including homeland defense missions and force protection for our deployed forces. It's also that part of the spectrum that any land-based system would use to identify incoming weapons using radar. If confirmed, will you advocate for protecting the Department of Defense's warfighting systems that require spectrum to function optimally, including the radars that will make President Trump's Golden Dome possible?
I will, Senator.
And if confirmed, will you speak candidly with Congress on the effects of any spectrum-related policies entertained by the interagency that may have an effect on the Department of Defense's capabilities to use those portions of the spectrum that they currently control?
I will, Senator.
Thank you, sir. Sir, also in my office, you have, and I consider it very courageously, you've called for the genuine focus on countering China as the principal threat to the United States and providing the commensurate resources to Indo-PACOM. In my office, we discussed the fact that in the event the U.S. and China engage in hostilities, adversaries like Russia and Iran will seek to press their own advantage in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. It's for that purpose that the NDAA currently requires a review to see whether or not we're actually capable and what our needs are to actually be able to sustain a war on more than one front. I'm convinced that if we have a war on one front, we're going to have a war on two fronts. Can you talk about what your thoughts are on that and whether or not in your role as a planner, you have to be able to respond to adversaries on more than one front?
Well, thank you, Senator. I really appreciate that, and I fully agree with your fear, and I know the chairman and others have made this a real concern, and I applaud the committee's focus on this point. We have to have a multi-front or multi-war strategy, even though the reality is that the force planning construct of the 2022 National Defense Strategy is not a three-war military or something. I think it's a one and change, if I could speak informally. So that is a real problem, because not only do I think that other hostile actors could act opportunistically, I think there's a very good chance that, for instance, if China wanted to take the cosmic roll of the dice, as Harold Brown put it, that they would induce their other partners with whom they are now much more closely collaborating to also go at the same time, perhaps even before, to draw us away. So we have to have a strategy for that. I think our own strategy is to revamp our defense industrial base, the readiness, the president's very appropriate and justified desire to restore our military strength, more capable allies. So I have a different view than Senator Hirono. I think that what's happening in Europe is actually very positive, that the Europeans are saying we need to do more for our own defense. I think people now, having dealt with the Europeans ad nauseum for many years on this kind of thing, I think there's finally an acceptance that there really needs to be more to be done.
My time will run out, but I want to make something very clear on this. If we're expecting that our European allies are going to be able to defend us in the case of having a war on two fronts, I don't think we can do that. I think they can help us, but I think we have to be in a position to respond to that. Would you agree?
I think we have to be able to defend ourselves, obviously, without relying on anybody else, Senator, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very, very much. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Colby, who instigated the war in Gaza?
Well, the October 7th, the barbaric attacks against, Israel were the precipitating factor.
By Hamas.
By Hamas, yeah.
Yeah, so
Backed by Iran.
There's a delicate ceasefire negotiation going on right now, but you didn't have any trouble saying who was the instigator of the attack.
I would look at it differently, Senator,
you equivocated about the Russian invasion.
If I could stop both of my friends. There's been some talking over, and our stenographers having trouble. So if we could avoid that.
Yeah, you were introduced as a truth teller by the vice president. That's a really important thing. And my point is, if you're willing to say the truth about the Hamas invasion of Israel, I hope you wouldn't be equivocal about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let me ask you about two particular topics. In your advanced policy questions on page 4748, you were asked a question about transnational criminal organizations. And I'm curious about this. TCOs, including those transporting fentanyl, pose a direct threat to Americans. I believe this is a very important matter for the U.S. government to address. The United States should do so in ways that are practical, results-oriented, and sustainable. In light of this, the lead organizations are likely normally to be non-DOD. You then went on to say the DOD plays an important role. Talk a little bit about the way you see the effort against TCOs, the lead role of non-DOD and the supporting role of DOD.
Well, thanks, Senator, and I know this is a special focus of yours, so this is something I'd want to learn more about, but I'm very conscious that, and this gets to some of the sort of back and forth in other contexts, that military force is not a panacea. It's critical. It needs to be part of the so-called, of the president's menu of options, and in certain cases, it's absolutely necessary and can solve a problem. But things like transnational criminal organizations that are, crime has been with us since we got out of the, out of the jungles or whatever. It's going to be there, but we can reduce it. I think a big part of that is going to be obviously integration with the diplomatic arms, with capable partners who are willing to and able to do more, for instance, in places like Latin America and other places as well. So I see DOD, I think it's important for the department to be more aware and active in those conversations. My impression, somewhat from within the department, but often from the outside, is that that's considered to be sort of out of the department's purview. I think it's important that the department be there, not necessarily always saying everything's to be solved with a hammer, but to be part of that conversation. And I'll say, I think the kind of people who are being populated in the senior levels of the State Department and elsewhere, the National Security Council, I would believe I could have a very good conversation and integration and collaboration along those lines, as well as Congress on these issues.
And I think when you talk to the Southcom leadership, they're going to really emphasize that a lot of non-DOD assets are very important in this fight. I want to ask you a question about AUKUS. Because I'm on foreign relations and armed services, I've been pretty involved in the AUKUS framework. Pillar 1 also is pretty heavily invested in Virginia. You did a tweet in August where you said, AUKUS, in principle, it's a great idea. But I've been very skeptical in practice. I remain skeptical, agnostic as I put it, but more inclined based on new information I've gleaned. It would be crazy to have fewer SSNs, Virginia class, in the right place and time. Talk a little bit about your perspective on AUKUS, the promise of the concept, and if there's practical skepticality, what that is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that. And this is another area where, as I mentioned in my opening statement, where new facts arise. I mean, my perspective is fundamentally, I would say, realistic or pragmatic and kind of data-driven, if you want, adaptive, based on new facts. The idea of empowering our Australian, in some sense, perhaps our closest ally in the world, they've been with us even in our less advisable wars, is the way I put it. It's a great idea for them to have attack submarines. But the problem is that we are, as Secretary Rubio has said and others, there's a very real threat of a conflict in the coming years, God forbid, over, along the first island chain. And our attack submarines, as you know well, Senator, are absolutely essential for making the defense of Taiwan or otherwise a viable and practical option, to my conversation with Senator Cotton. So if we can produce the attack submarines in sufficient number and sufficient speed, then great. But if we can't, that becomes a very difficult problem, because we don't want our servicemen and women to be in a weaker position and more vulnerable, and God forbid worse, because they're not in the right place in the right time. So my perspective, and what I've told the Australians and also the Brits, is, if confirmed, or before, I think it should be the policy of the United States government to do everything we can to make this work. And again, as we talked about in your office, Senator, this is getting back to restoring our defense industrial capacity so that we don't have to face these awful choices, but rather can be in a position where we can produce not only for ourselves, but for our allies.
Having more capacity, even if it's a joint capacity, is a good thing. We just have to be careful as we try to produce an Australian capacity that we don't end up in a time period where we're sort of less than we would otherwise be.
Precisely, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Ernst.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to you, Mr. Colby, and I want to welcome your family as well. Thank you for joining us today. I do appreciate your ongoing service and commitment to our Department of Defense. So for years, I've been calling out the waste, fraud, and abuse that we have had at the Pentagon to ensure that our taxpayer dollars are used to support our war fighters and protecting our nation. And the Department of Defense, which controls the largest portion of our discretionary budget in the federal government, has never once passed a full financial audit. The failure erodes public trust and prevents efficient use of taxpayer dollars for critical defense priorities. So, Mr. Colby, what policies will you put into place to ensure that the DOD passes an audit, as the law requires, by 2028?
Well, Senator, thank you very much, and thanks for your kind words for my family, as well as the other senators. absolutely would regard it as a priority, if confirmed, to make sure that the policies are in place to encourage efficiency and compliance with the federal audit. I agree with you, Senator. I mean, for the amount of money that we're spending, we should be getting better results, and I'm confident, and of course your leadership in the Doge Caucus and so forth, this is a real potential where we could get much better results and have a better defense industrial base kind of situation, better readiness for our forces. So I would certainly commit. I don't have a specific recommendation at this point, but I'd most welcome hearing your thoughts and your team's thoughts about how to do that.
Well, thank you, and I truly look forward to working with you on that issue as well. Let's go to the Middle East. I know there has been a lot of discussion already this morning about the Middle East and Central Command. The signing of the Abraham Accords during the first Trump administration, significant achievement. It was monumental. It was a strategic breakthrough for the region. I've worked to expand this agreement through legislation in previous defense bills. We've focused on enhanced integration with our partners, which could be the examples that we've had: air and missile defense, artificial intelligence capabilities, and maritime cooperation to counter Iran. So what are your thoughts in expanding the Abraham Accords? How can we accomplish that?
Well, thanks, Senator. I think the Abraham Accords were a triumph of President Trump's first term, and I'm very hopeful that they can be built on in this term. I think they're an example of where diplomacy that isn't expected and maybe kind of unorthodox in certain ways can nonetheless come about. And I think it offers part of the solution to dealing with Iran's regional hegemonic aspirations, its use of proxies and so forth, although it's not exclusively so. But I think, if confirmed from a defense point of view, this is an area where there's a lot that can be done to build up the capabilities of those like the Emiratis, the Saudis with their reforms, obviously consistent with Israel's qualitative military edge and so forth. But I'm a really big fan of the Abraham Accords and the model, and I'd be, if confirmed, I'd put a lot of sort of shoulder into it.
Wonderful. And you mentioned the Emiratis, but also the Saudis as well. So thoughts on normalization, how we could assist with that with the kingdom? Well,
Senator, I'm not fully briefed on exactly where things are. I think the more we can promote and encourage normalization, I assume you mean between Riyadh and Jerusalem, I think that would be that would be a huge coup. I've seen reporting on that. In the press, I don't know where things stand. Again, that's an area where quiet diplomacy probably makes is probably the most effective. But I certainly, I think that would be an incredible thing. And if I were confirmed, I would certainly I would support that efforts in that direction.
I do too. I think that would lend to additional stability across the Middle East by the addition of that normalization between Jerusalem and Riyadh. So as we discussed during our in-office meeting, I've been working a very long time to combat sexual assault in our military. Secretary Hegseth committed to appointing a senior official to ensure a focus on sexual assault prevention within the Department of Defense. So, Mr. Colby, if confirmed, will you work with me on this appointment to ensure focused leadership on this critical issue? And will you commit to providing Congress with regular updates on the progress made in this area?
I will, Senator.
Okay, I appreciate just being straightforward on that. Thank you. So again, just in remaining time, and I know my dear friend from Alaska will talk a little more about NATO, but talking about how relationships matter around the globe, just in the remaining time, just give me your stance on America remain engaged on the world stage.
Yes, Senator, I think America should remain engaged on the world stage, and a lot of what I'm trying to argue for is a way to do that, and I think is sustainable with the threats that we face and the national resources we have and our long-term interests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colby. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Colby, I think I'm going to ask you to enlarge on that on the record. So at this point, I think that'd be helpful. Senator King, Senator Warren beat you here, so she gets to go first. Senator Warren. No, Senator. Okay. Senator King.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, the Vice President characterized you as a truth teller, someone who would tell the truth to power, and yet today you've not told truth of who started the war in Ukraine. I'll give you one more chance. Who started the war in Ukraine?
Well, Senator, I would tell the truth. I don't think I'm saying anything that's untrue, but I also think it's important to be discreet and say things at the appropriate time and place.
The problem is, you tell us you're going to tell truth to power. The most obvious truth is that Russia invaded Ukraine. Everybody in the world knows that. And you won't say it here today because it appears that you don't want to offend the president. But that's the whole point of the vice president's testimony, that you would say truth to power, but you won't do it here today on the record. This is an obvious truth. Reminds me of the old country song, who are you going to believe, me or your own lying eyes? We all saw it.
Well, Senator, the way I see it, sir, is that diplomacy, especially a very delicate period where I'm hoping personally hoping that things very much get back on track and head towards
But
peace.
shouldn't diplomacy be based on the truth? Well, you've made your non-point, I suppose. Let's talk about terrorism. Deterrence doesn't work with terrorism. That's one of the problems, and I'm afraid this country has taken its eye off of terrorism. You talk about China, others have talked about the Middle East, but terrorism is a consistent threat. ISIS-K is trying to make a comeback in Syria. The Al-Qaeda is active in Afghanistan and other places. But deterrence doesn't work. They don't have a capital city to blow up. They don't care about dying. Intelligence is our best defense against terrorism, and yet we're seeing the greatest loss of jobs, of firings in the CIA in something like 50 years. Talk to me about how do we deal with the threat of terrorism when we're cutting our intelligence capacity?
Well, Senator, I very much agree with you about the enduring threat of terrorism. In fact, when I wrote my book, I thought, and I did the defense strategy with others back in 2017, 2018, this is something I was very much thinking of. In fact, a little personal, I mean, I was walking with my two sons, who obviously don't remember this, but on last 9/11, and conveying to them how vividly I remember that. So that is not something that I take for granted. And we do have, a transnational jihadi terrorism. So I think this absolutely does, and my argument would be, and if confirmed, I would ensure, to the extent it was in my power, that preventing terrorist attacks against Americans and our allies where possible should be an enduring role of the American military. Obviously, that's a critical part of intelligence as well.
But as I've thought about this for many years, intelligence is really the best defense. Deterrence doesn't work, as I said, and yet we're eviscerating our intelligence capability as we're sitting here today.
Well, Senator, I couldn't speak intelligently. I'm just reading the news reports about what exactly is going on in terms of at the CIA and others. But I have confidence that Director Radcliffe and others are making things more efficient, more focused, more lethal. I know they're trying to make, in fact, try to encourage, as far as I understand, try to encourage case officers and others to go into more dangerous assignments precisely to prevent such an outcome.
I hope you're right. Just a note on Taiwan. To me, one of the critical questions is how much is Taiwan committed to its own defense? It's disturbing to me that in recent months, the Parliament of Taiwan has moved to cut their defense budget. And how are we to be expected to think about sending Americans into harm's way on behalf of a entity that doesn't seem all that interested in protecting itself? Are you disturbed by that move in the Taiwanese parliament?
I'm profoundly disturbed, Senator, and I think the question that you're raising is one that I've heard not only Democrats but Republicans raise often in private. Secretary Mattis, who was mentioned earlier, said we can't care more about your defense than you can. So this is where I think I've been trying in my communication and my recommendations for policy vis-a-vis Taiwan to try to induce them in whatever way possible to become, say, more like South Korea. So it's a very plausible model with a much more serious military, because not only do I don't think it's fair to Americans to ask Americans and our servicemen and women to suffer at great if our allies are not pulling their weight, but also that it won't even be viable.
One more truth to power question. Last week, the United States ceased supporting the restoration and protection of the electric grid in Ukraine, which the Russians have continuously targeted. Yesterday, the administration announced its cutoff of military aid to Ukraine. Do you believe that those two things together, undermining the security of Ukraine in this critical moment, are good ideas?
Senator, as I said, I think the critical thing at this point is for advance in the peace process, and for us, including Kiev, to get to cooperate, I think there's an opportunity.
You're all
to-
about policy. I'm asking, do you think the cutoff of aid to Ukraine yesterday is good policy?
Well, Senator, I'm only seeing the reports recently, but I think we need to get, I think the president has a plan for us to end this war and a sustainable model for a secure and sovereign Ukraine and a Europe that can, be more defensible. And I think that's the route that we should all take.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Senator Sullivan, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, good to see you and your family. Thank you to your family for serving everybody. I know your father's served his country very admirably as well, so thank you, all of you. I want to just make a point. 4 years ago, when the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy was testifying at his confirmation hearing, President Biden's Undersecretary, he said that one of his top priorities was to, quote, stamp out systemic racism within the ranks, unquote. My view is that began the woke assault on the military. Do you believe our military is systemically racist, Mr. Colby?
I do not, Senator.
And will you work with this committee and Secretary Hegseth to stamp out the remaining remnants of the woke assault that we spent 4 years dealing with under Biden and his Undersecretary of Policy and everybody else?
Senator, I commit to you to work to and support of Secretary Hegseth, if confirmed, to restore a focus on lethality, readiness, and meritocracy, and these kinds of values.
Good. I think that's the right focus, and our military is not systemically racist, despite what the last administration told everybody. Alliances, I'm glad to see in your short, brief, but powerful opening statement, you talked about the power of alliances. Do you agree that our alliances throughout the world are a source of American power and strength?
I do, Senator. I think they need to be, as I said, adapted and made more sustainable, and that's the approach that I would take, fixing rather than dumping is my approach.
The ambassador for NATO is having his confirmation hearing right now as we speak, downstairs and upstairs or somewhere in the Foreign Relations Committee. That's Matt Whitaker. He has testified already this morning. He's a strong supporter of the NATO alliance. Are you a strong supporter of the NATO alliance? And getting them to get to 2% or 3%, certainly. But you still think that's a useful, important alliance for the United States?
I do. Again, Senator, I very much believe in NATO, but I believe it has to, I think the phrase is it has to adapt to, things must change to stay the same, basically, the logic being they've got to be able to, it's got to actually go back, in my view, to something closer to what it was in the Cold War. I like to point out the West German military in 1988, two-thirds the size of current Germany, had 12 active divisions. The Germans can't put a single division together now. It's not tenable. And so I think we're seeing progress. Now the question is, how do we manage this dangerous period of transition?
I agree with all that, but it's worth reforming because it does provide power and strength to the United States.
Yeah, I think the NATO alliance is important.
Let me reinforce Senator Cotton's important line of questions this morning, and I appreciate those. Just to be clear, your suggestions in previous writings, you had a Wall Street Journal editorial that was highlighting those today, that we could tolerate Iran with a nuclear weapon, a suggestion, is no longer your view, correct?
Well, Senator, if I could elaborate on this.
I would just be real quick.
Yeah, but I believe we should not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and if confirmed, I would believe that it's my responsibility to provide credible, good military.
And that's your personal view, because a lot of times you can say, well,
that's
the president said it.
That's my own
so
view.
that's kind of mine, but you don't really believe it. But you believe that,
I believe
right?
that.
Personally.
Yes, and Senator, if I could.
It's important, by the way. That's your
I
personal
agree.
view.
No, and what I was saying, first of all, I've been in the policy debate a long time. Not everything I said I would say.
Get that. You're a public intellectual. You can't be held to.
But not anymore. Obviously, I'm up for a job of great public responsibility, so I understand that. But also, I would say a lot of what I was arguing against at the time, these conversations 15 years ago, a lot of the opponents I felt had a casual or some cases even flippant attitude towards the employment of military force.
Yep.
And that's a lot of what I was arguing against. Was my wording always appropriate? Was my precise framing always appropriate? No, but I think
Iran with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat to the United States.
And I think that we now have the leadership with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and ultimately the President who understand that we need to be militarily strong, but also understand the downside risks of the employment of military force. It needs to be rational.
Do you fully support the President's return to maximum pressure?
I do, Senator, yeah.
Let me talk on, real quick, I only got 40 seconds left. Your 2018 National Security Strategy I thought was excellent. Well done. The rebalance to focus on great power competition, very important. but also there's an element of deterrence in that that's still important. And you've written in your excellent book, Strategy of Denial, that we need to provide a credible deterrent in the Taiwan Strait to prevent China from achieving regional hegemony. But on deterrence itself, here's my question. Is deterrence divisible for the United States? And what I mean by that is, you know, when people say, well, we can let bad guys, Putin, roll in Europe, Iran, roll in the Middle East, but we're going to be strong in the Taiwan Strait. Is deterrence divisible in that way? I think it's not. Just look at Joe Biden, Afghanistan. Holy cow, that was a disaster. And guess what happened? And I predicted this. Every bad guy in the world was like, hey, I'm making my move. Putin probably would not have even invaded Ukraine had it not been for Afghanistan. Same with Hamas and Iran, with Israel. So is it, we got to rebalance, but is deterrence divisible? Because I think that's where you and I might have a little disagreement and you get into the danger zone there. I don't think it is, but what do you think?
I think, Senator, that things are definitely interconnected, but what I'll say, and I recognize I'm over time, is that it's really important. I can't remember who said it, but you got to have the right stuff in the right place at the right time, and we need to make sure that we've got that. So we've got to do both of these things. We have to pay attention to the political credibility issues and how we're perceived, but at the end of the day, as you know well, given your distinguished military service, Senator, we need to have the right stuff in the right place at the right time to have the right effect. As I think Douglas MacArthur famously said, the two most infamous words in military history are too late, right? And I think that's really what that side of the equation is what I'm driving towards, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colby. Now, a vote has begun. This hearing will continue, and members, if they will, may just run to vote and then come back. The ranking member has gone to vote now. And Senator Kelly, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, great seeing you and your family here. In introducing you, the Vice President Vance said the following, this is a quote, "You need good people in government. You need people who are going to tell the truth, who are going to look you in the eye, who are going to disagree, sometimes amicably, but actually be willing to look you in the eye and have an important conversation. Who you can trust to tell you what they actually think, agree, or disagree. And that's the kind of person that bridges." On his larger point, I agree strongly. In any business or organization or team, you need people willing to speak their mind. It's especially important in this role, where you would be setting the policy of the Department of Defense at a very dangerous time. So I've got a couple simple questions for you. Are there Russian troops fighting in Ukraine?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. I really appreciate your being straightforward. Is it easier or harder for the United States to shift its focus more towards the Pacific if Putin is successful in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's certainly a critical factor. I mean, there are other factors that we talked about, but I think it would be better if there's a peace and a secure and sovereign Ukraine and a NATO that's more capable of defending itself. That would make things easier for sure.
If Putin is perceived as being successful, and if he comes out of this feeling that this worked out in his favor, do you think that puts other European countries at risk?
Well, I think it's clear that European countries need to take more responsibility for their own security, and I think that's already happening, and I think we actually want to encourage that. I mean, this is, again, where I have a somewhat different view than Senator Hirono. I think the dynamics that are going on where European leaders are now saying, hey, we're going to actually do a lot more, that's actually something that we should encourage and enable. And I would say a new approach that I would advocate for and that I have been advocating for, if confirmed, would be to enable, work with Europeans and work with the positive trajectory that they're on now to give them more capability to do so.
That's one side of the risk calculation. That's just one side. The other side is Putin and how he feels. And my concern is if we set the conditions here where he feels a year, 3, 5 years from now that this was worthwhile for him, he gained territory, maybe Ukraine is not a member of NATO, that puts our European allies at risk regardless of the steps that they take now. So, and I've spoken to leadership in Baltic nations, in Poland, in Finland, and this is a concern of theirs as well.
Well, Senator, what I would say, and I think consistent with what the President, Secretary of State, and others have said, is that we should, really emphasis on the verify. You can trust, but definitely verify. I don't think we should take anything for granted, and I think the Europeans and our own military reforms going forward should make sure that President Putin or whoever's in charge in the Kremlin doesn't see it as advantageous to test the boundaries, of our security perimeter.
Do you view Putin as a war criminal?
Senator, that's the kind of thing that I just don't want to, I don't think it's appropriate for me, and it would as I said, that these words are very important as the President. I don't think I'm the right person to be commenting on this one or the other. There's factual matters, obviously, I can comment on that are not, but I think at this point, my honestly personal interest is in making sure that I don't do anything that would disrupt the resumption of a move towards peace that I think would benefit Ukraine.
Do you believe there were war crimes committed in Ukraine?
Senator, again, I mean, others, certainly that I don't think it's appropriate for me to be commenting on these more delicate issues.
Could you explain how negotiations are harmed if we state something that is self-evident? How does that harm negotiations?
Well, Senator, I think in all negotiations, there's often time and place. You can have something in a private conversation that's much different. I think we should be clear-eyed and understanding and about what's going on and be frank with the Russians and others. But I think having that in public is a very different, I mean, for instance, the one China policy, I think we've touched on it. There are certain things that we understand that are
You mentioned
delicate.
in public, so
Yeah.
you don't think it's a good idea to negotiate things in public?
I generally think that these things should be, conducted behind closed doors in the appropriate form. Sometimes it might be in public, but I think that's not something that I'm driving the train on, nor would I be
I agree
considered
with
for
you.
a job.
I don't think we should negotiate in public. That did not happen last week.
Well, my understanding is that was the President, the Vice President's point was that exactly that. So,
Well, on another subject here, where at DOD's focused on providing, and I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but we talked about asymmetric advantage in my office in the Indo-PACOM AOR. It's important we maintain, in my view, an asymmetric advantage. I hope you take a very close look at NGAD as we move forward, assuming you're confirmed for this role.
thank you, Senator. I would welcome that. I'd certainly commit to taking a closer look at that.
Thank you.
You welcome back and recognize the fast-recovering and apparently hard-headed Senator Kramer.
I haven't recovered fully, but thank you. And thank you, Mr. Colby, for being here. To your family, congratulations. Thank you for stepping in the gap again. And by the way, just to prove that I get along well with my Democratic friends, I agree with Senator Kelly and his point about NGAD. I think it needs to be a high priority. Air dominance needs to be a high priority for our Air Force. However, I also sense and understand your frustration, although I must say you've done marvelously in answering their attempts to get you to say something that may upset the delicate balance right now going on between the various players in this hopefully, negotiation to peace in Ukraine. You're so much younger than me, but at least you are a student of history. Ronald Reagan was the first president I was able to vote for. And I believe he referred to communism in very negative terms, and in fact called the Soviet Union an evil empire. I also sort of recall that he once referred to Mikhail Gorbachev as his friend. It must be easier to negotiate with a friend than it is with an evil empire. Just a point I'm trying to make historically. Granted, not every situation is the same. These are not identical. The human beings in this matter are not the same. But I think the process is similar. And so I applaud your diplomacy in this room today. Speaking of age, literally the year I was born, the first intercontinental ballistic missile was invented, and 2 years later, the first one was installed at Minot, North Dakota, the Minuteman I. The Minuteman III came along after some time, and of course, we also have 70-year-old B-52 bombers. Both of those vehicles, of course, carry nuclear warheads, and Minot Air Force Base contains and protects the large majority of nuclear material in our arsenal. So I've literally watched nuclear deterrence work up close and personal, and have very much appreciated in my career in Congress and the United States Senate, getting to know not just the processes, not just the systems, the very old systems, every bit as old as I am, but also the airmen that protect them, that fly them, that operate them. Really rather remarkable. I want to drill down with that a little bit with what you were visiting with, of course, Senator Fisher about, and maybe even get even more specific in that sense that the particularly the land-based deterrent, the Sentinel, has had some challenges. We don't do this very often, obviously, like every 60 or 70 years. And so we find ourselves in a crunch financially with regard to Sentinel. Will you commit, I mean, just commit today that you will advise the President and Congress, but especially the President, that we really do need to have that deterrence that has worked so well for so long that not a single ICBM with a nuclear warhead has had to be fired?
Yes, Senator, thanks very much. And I do commit to advising the support for the ICBM and the Triad and the land-based leg and the Sentinel program as well. Obviously, there are concerns about the health of the program, so that would, if confirmed, that would be a priority, working alongside ANS and other, the Secretary of the Air Force, to try to get that thing back on track. But certainly, you have my commitment.
As long as we're on the issue of the Air Force, many administrations, recent administrations, have been shedding, it seems, the responsibility of the Air Force to provide good ISR, airborne ISR. Lately, of course, the advent of a Space Force, which I strongly support, has provided another layer of ISR. However, airborne ISR remains, in my view, very important. COCOMs tell us all the time how important it is, and yet we're seeing what I believe is an escalation of shedding ISR by the United States Air Force, particularly modern ISR. I would just ask what your level of commitment is to providing. First of all, you're important. How important you feel ISR, airborne ISR, is to the Air Force and to the COCOMs, and your level of commitment to overseeing.
Well, thanks, Senator. Thanks very much. Thanks, Senator. Thanks very much. And as we discussed in your office, Senator, I think that airborne ISR is very important, especially for its own reasons, but also because we cannot solely rely on the space-based layer. I would also just say, Senator, if I could, and it's really nice to see you, and I hope your recovery goes very well. Thank you for being here today. I believe President Reagan, when he went to Moscow and he was asked about the evil empire during the period when he was engaging with President Gorbachev, and he kind of demurred. He said, this isn't, he said something like, well, I wouldn't put it that way at this time. So I think that shows actually President Reagan is a great example of having a clear moral, vision, but also understanding that there's a place and time for everything, and being able to move and adapt to take advantage of new circumstances.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Mr. Colby, good to see you, and congratulations on your nomination. It was good spending time with you in my office, discussing a variety of issues. And one of the things we talked about was how Detroit is a major contributor to the Allied war effort now, but famously back in World War II, producing tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and other weapons, nicknamed the Arsenal of Democracy by President Franklin Roosevelt. And I think you described it as the Detroit deterrent. So I liked that saying. Your previous work on the National Defense Strategy emphasized shipbuilding dominance, and you stated improving the industrial base was going to be one of your top priorities if confirmed. We both share the same goal to expand the industrial base. Not just in Michigan, but around the country, although my focus, of course, is in Michigan. So my question for you, sir, is if confirmed, what policies or initiatives would you lead to mobilize national military industrial base? We have to outproduce our adversaries, and this is going to be critical, but how would you prioritize that? And specifically, how?
Well, thank you very much, Senator, and I really appreciate our discussion as well. So appreciate the kind words, and I absolutely share your conviction on this and an attempt to move it forward. Obviously, a lot of the responsibility for these issues would be in places like the service secretaries and acquisition and sustainment and so forth. I would see my role, and I'd really welcome hearing more from you and your staff, Senator, on this topic, is really driving at a national level from the department on down. Obviously, if you look at the statutory responsibilities of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, it's things like the National Defense Strategy, which should be the primary guidance for the department, as well as dealing with the interagency. I think that is a very important platform and basis to engage both within and outside the department to drive what I would think of as really a national mobilization of our defense industrial base as part of a broader reindustrialization effort, because it's not going to work if it's just the defense industrial base, and try to restore some of that Detroit deterrent.
Great, wonderful. Mr. Colby, there are proposals for a space-based Iron Dome for America, and that has gained certainly traction in some political circles. Despite what are known technical challenges, certainly cost concerns as well. As you know, Northcom and Southcom both face some real operational challenges now, including domain awareness gaps, critical infrastructure protection, a whole host of challenges. So my question for you is, how do you evaluate the feasibility of such an Iron Dome concept for defending the entire U.S. homeland, given the competing operational challenges that both Northcom and Southcom currently face?
Well, thanks, Senator. I understand where you're coming from. I believe in, and you know, having spent a lot of time studying the history of kind of missile defense capabilities, I think those are very valid questions. I fully support the President's EO and the Golden Dome approach, in large part because I think the range and scale and type and sophistication of missile and other unmanned threats, the homeland is growing, and so we need to keep pace with that. I do think one of the reasons, again, where sort of, you know, the Keynes line, facts change, so, you know, my recommendations change, is I think some of the technology breakthroughs that we've seen in things like drones and unmanned systems, as well as in artificial intelligence, you know, and related fields, could really drive down the cost curve and offer up technology capabilities or technology solutions and results that would give us a much better bang for our buck, if you will. Now, a lot of that would be in places like R&E and other places, but I think that's a very reasonable, you know, basis to move forward and not just kind of pie in the sky thinking.
As you know, the Air Force has requested billions of dollars to research and build collaborative combat aircraft, which, as you know, are the unmanned powered aircraft controlled by very advanced AI systems that can complete missions on their own or be deployed in combination with human-piloted fighters. These autonomous aircraft are probably particularly crucial when we think about the Indo-Pacific and the vast range that encompasses. My question for you is, if confirmed, how do you see CCAs being utilized and integrated into Indo-PACOM? And is that the place where they would have probably the most use?
Well, thanks, Senator. I mean, unfortunately, my knowledge of this is really from reading the defense press and on the outside, so I don't feel I have the basis to give you a really informed answer, but I would say that I think we do need to see unmanned systems operating alongside manned systems in an integrated fashion with other unmanned systems as part of the operational concepts for the future, especially in places like the Pacific, given not only the long ranges, but the scale and density and sophistication of Chinese integrated air defenses.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you very, very much, Senator Scott.
Sure. Mr. Colby, congratulations first on your nomination, and thanks for being here. Thank you for taking the opportunity to meet with me. And, you know, you made a commitment when we met that you're going to do everything you can to enact President Trump's agenda, standing with our allies, including Israel, and bringing peace back through strength. So as we talked about, I represent Florida, got a big Jewish population, very pro-Israel population in my state. After 4 years of President Biden's complete abandonment of Israel and appeasement of dangerous regimes in Iran, China, and more, I thank God we have President Trump back in the White House, the most pro-Israel president in our nation's history. President Trump has already made clear that as long as he is president, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. And I've been encouraged by the decisive actions he's taken so far to restore maximum pressure on Iran. I've heard concerns, as you know, from my constituents. So can you talk about your previous comments on Iran and your commitment to supporting Israel and supporting the president's agenda.
Sure. Thank you very much, Senator. As you said, I'm honored to be nominated by President Trump. I would be honored to serve in his administration if confirmed. I believe he has the right America First, peace through strength perspective. He's an excellent negotiator, and I think he's putting together a great team. And if confirmed, I'd be honored to serve among them. I believe I have a very strong record, more than strong, airtight, a record on support for Israel, which I've referred to as a model ally. I think it's a key interest of the United States, and its security has been obviously taken a huge body blow as a result of the Hamas attacks and the concurrent attacks or subsequent attacks from Iran and its proxies and so forth. And I've publicly stood with Israel. I believe it's important to have the memorandum of understanding and so forth, that we stand behind Israel not only politically but financially and with wherever possible and as part of our overall strategy, militarily and so forth. On the issue of Iran, I've made clear that my personal position, as Senator Sullivan rightly underlines, is that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. We should deny Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and that if confirmed, it would be my personal responsibility, and my duty, to present the president with very good, plausible options that are credible options that are consistent, I should stress, with the president's overall approach, of course, which is to try to have a trust but verify negotiated agreement or something like it. But you got to have the hammer there available. What I would say, Senator, and I was discussing with Senator Sullivan a little bit, is the way that I would look at the overall kind of arc of my thinking, if you'll permit me, is to say the thrust of my thinking and advocacy over the years and my strategic approach has been, we got to get the ends, ways, and means together. We got to have something close. I think what President Trump is talking about, very similar, and we were talking about President Reagan, to the Weinberger Doctrine. Say, if you're going to, you need to be strong to get peace. But if we're going to put American forces into action, we're going to have a clear goal. It's going to have an exit strategy that's plausible. That doesn't mean inaction, but that's the kind of thing. And a lot of my advocacy and commentary, especially as a kind of public intellectual, if you will, was pushing back against a lot of people who, frankly, I would say, were quite cavalier about the employment of military force. And I think, to your point, Senator, with President Trump's leadership, with the Vice President, with Secretary of Defense Hegseth, we have a team that understands strength, for sure, that understands the role of negotiation, but also understands that it's important, the downside risks of the use of military force and the importance of not being cavalier about it, employing our men and women in uniform.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The prior administration withheld and slowed down the delivery of bombs to Israel and the Joint Direct Action munition kits that convert those bombs into precision-guided munitions. In this row, I think would you just go on and commit that you agree that we should reverse the Forbes administration's anti-Israel policies and correct any bureaucratic holdups that are delaying any U.S. arms to Israel?
I agree, Senator, and what I've said and what I would say here again is, if confirmed, I would advocate removing kind of the bear hug, which is to say Israel is a model ally in the sense that it's a capable and willing ally that isn't asking us to fight all its own fights. It's basically wants the ability and capability and backing to go out and take care of business. And I think a very effective example of that ends, ways, means model is exactly Israel's actions against Hezbollah and Iran itself a few months ago, which I think were very effective, and they left us in a better position. Obviously, they didn't solve the problem of Hezbollah and Iran. I think the Israelis are realists like we should be, which is to say the threat doesn't just go away, but they put themselves and us in a better position by the intelligent and robust application of military force in a politically smart way.
The last one's a real easy question. Do you agree that the government of China has made the decision to become our adversary?
I think, yes, absolutely. I think that's correct, Senator.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Colby, in the context of your answer, what is the bear hug?
My understanding of the bear hug, from what I've been reading, is a kind of a sort of like a hovering kind of control over Israel's decisions that some people advocate, which is saying, we're going to pick and choose exactly what you can and can't do. My view, that I think is consistent with the president's view, if I may say, Senator, is that we should be looking for allies who are able but also willing to do things more autonomously and take action. I think in the case of, for instance, Hezbollah, again, just relying on public reporting, I'm not sure how much we in the United States even really knew about it, but it was very effective, and I think it ended up being more in our interest.
Thank you for that explanation. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your nomination, Mr. Colby. So the U.S. does not target innocent civilians, and not only because that's what's right, it is also that's what's effective. General Stanley McChrystal coined the term insurgent math. You may remember hearing about this, meaning that for every civilian you kill, you create 10 new enemies. U.S. airstrikes killed as many as 48,000 civilians between 2001 and 2021. You can do the math on that. Now, most people know that killing civilians is wrong and should be rare. And when it has happened, our troops file reports. But too often, those reports don't actually receive a response from anyone. And we don't learn how to avoid future accidents that result in civilian deaths. And that's why Congress passed several reforms into law to reduce civilian harm and to improve our guidance for our service members, including establishing the Civilian Protection Center of Excellence. This center helps make military operations more effective, and it also supports troops in preventing and responding to civilian harm. So let me ask you, Mr. Colby, if confirmed, will you oversee implementation of these reforms? Do you agree that preventing civilian deaths enhances U.S. national security, including reducing risks to our own troops?
I do agree with that, Senator.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. It's very important. This isn't a partisan issue. During the first Trump administration, the Pentagon grew concerned about the number of civilian deaths resulting from operations that were in place to try to defeat ISIS, and it launched a study. And Secretaries of Defense Mattis and Esper and Austin all took steps to reduce civilian harm across the administrations. So today, the Center of Excellence helps commanders sharpen their campaign plans so they can make smarter decisions about strikes that they need to deploy. So, Mr. Colby, do you agree that commanders can make better decisions in the field when they're equipped with training on how to avoid civilian casualties?
I do, Senator.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Following the laws of war helps set us apart from terrorists and from adversaries like Russia, which has targeted civilians in Ukraine. American troops also rely on Judge Advocate General's Corps for legal advice. Senator Graham, who himself was a JAG, rightly called the JAGs the conscience of the military. Mr. Colby, do you think it's important that commanders have legal advice that they can count on and trust?
I do, Senator.
Secretary Hedgecoth's outspoken disregard for the rules of war endangers U.S. troops, and his firing of the top military lawyers in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force last month, and his plans to reduce the rank of JAG leadership from a 3-star role to a 2-star role are deeply concerning. If confirmed as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, your views will send a message from the top about whether the laws of war matter. I urge you to take this seriously. I appreciate your answers today. If you want to expand on any of them, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you, Senator. I've seen the reports in the press, so I can't speak about it authoritatively. I trust Secretary Hegseth's judgment. What I would say is that if confirmed, I certainly would take the laws of war very seriously. It's something I've studied in the past. I've thought about a great deal. It's part of the overall ends, ways, means, and the rational use of military power. Again, not to be sanguine about it or blasé, but to say that observing the laws of war, understanding them in a reasonable way that's consistent with combat effectiveness and military effectiveness and achieving our goals and deterrence, I think that's a very important part of the picture that I think is part of the role of the USTP if confirmed.
I appreciate that, Mr. Colby. I think that helps keep our war fighters safer, and I also think it helps keep our nation safer. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Now we have Senator Tuberville, followed by Senator Duckworth.
Good morning, Mr. Colby. Good to see you and your family, and thank you for wanting to take on this job. It's going to be very difficult, but we think you can handle it. Mr. Colby, you advocate for a strategy of denial in military and geopolitical context. how does this concept translate to Central and South American places like Panama and the troubling amount of influence that China is starting to have and has had in that area? And by the way, they just announced that one of our major corporations is purchasing both ports at the Panama Canal, which is very good news.
Well, thanks very much, Senator. And I think the President's early initiatives on our hemisphere in places like Panama are very encouraging. I think this is part of an overall strategy, both to secure our own interests directly, secure the territorial integrity of our homeland from unchecked migration and lethal fentanyl flows that are killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, but also to, as you said, Senator, to ensure that China does not gain a foothold or beyond a dominant position in critical areas of Latin America, which I think was happening. I think that's a big part of the strategy now. I think part of that is up to the military, but a lot of it's part of the other agencies of government, the State Department. I know former Ambassador in Mexico, Ambassador Chris Landau, is going through his hearing downstairs, I believe. He's up for the Deputy Secretary of State. You know, I think that's the kind of relationship between DOD and the State Department where you have a clear picture that we've got to have a handle on our hemisphere. We're pursuing our own strategies, and we're also empowering countries in the hemisphere and in the region to contribute more to, through development, through better governance themselves, through alignment with the kind of common sense approaches that I think that we're following here, that can result in better outcomes for all of us.
Yeah, I think you'll find the new administration in Panama is very receptive for us too. Once you get in your position, you'll find that out. Been down there several times, and they need help as we need more access to the canal. So thank you for that. You know, in 2023, President Biden overrode President Trump, the Department of Air Force, and the findings of multiple studies, including an Inspector General review, and directed that the headquarters of Space Command remain in Colorado instead of moving to its selective location at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, my state. Mr. Colby, if confirmed, will you be the senior DOD official in charge of space policy? You will be, as well as strategy, plans, and capabilities for the entire department. Do you agree with me that, as a matter of policy, it is in our nation's best interest to make basing decisions on merit and not on political agendas?
I do, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, much of your work is about prioritizing our defense policy towards deterring aggression with China, our pacing challenge. What do you make of the progress made over the past few years by our adversaries toward integrating with their militaries? I'm talking about since Ukraine, Russia have had their conflict, all the people in the East basically are running to China. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's really, really disturbing, Senator. I think there has been this kind of, I think of as like a counter coalition. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. China's kind of the cornerstone of that coalition. It's by far the largest economy. Their support has made the Russian war effort in Ukraine sustainable. They're helping the Iranians are helping them. The Russians are helping the North Koreans. So I think there's a couple of things to be done about that. On the defense side, I think it's important for us to work with our allies to kind of plug the gaps in our perimeter. A lot of that is getting our forces in a better state of readiness, putting them in the right place, getting our defense industrial base back into good shape, robust defense funding, and then getting our allies to step up. I think a big part of this is we have some allies, Israel I've mentioned, India, South Korea, Poland, they're really pulling their weight. You could add Finland up there is doing a pretty good job, but a lot of the biggest economies in our alliance network really aren't pulling their weight. They're starting now, so I think there's a real opportunity to capitalize on that because together we are much wealthier than this counter coalition, but we've got to turn that into real military capability.
Your quick thoughts on BRICS?
I think, BRICS are a sort of a representation of the changing world dynamic. I think Secretary Rubio put it very well. We're no longer in Charles Krauthammer's unipolar world. We're in a world, the United States is still, I think, the strongest country out there, but China's the biggest, most powerful rival we've faced in probably 150 years, and other countries are making their decisions. Obviously, the Indians, who I think our relationship there is golden going forward, and we should really deepen that, and if confirmed, I would make a big priority of that. They're part of it, so it's complicated. But people are going to be moving around talking to, the Saudis are talking to the Russians, and they're talking to us. That's very common. That's how the world's going to be. That's the reality of the world system as it is now, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Tuberville. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, welcome. While I do not agree with many of your policy positions, I do recognize that you are one of the most experienced and knowledgeable nominees from this administration to come before this committee. And I appreciated our conversation in my office very much. It is clear to me that, unlike most Trump national security nominees, you actually have been putting in the work to become an expert in your field. That said, expertise alone is not enough. Integrity, adherence to the rule of law, and unwavering commitment to uphold our democratic institutions are just as essential. So as I do with every Trump administration candidate to come before this committee, I must ask, Mr. Colby, if President Trump or Secretary Hegseth asked you to do something illegal, unethical, or in direct violation of your oath to defend the Constitution, would you refuse to obey?
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for the kind words. I would say I contest the premise of the question. I don't think the President or the Secretary would ask such a question, but I am committed. I would absolutely not follow an unconstitutional or unlawful order.
Thank you. Mr. Colby, that was so easy. Why can't the others do that? Thank you for saying that. Mr. Colby, the global threat environment is more volatile than it has been in decades. Russia's aggression, China's growing assertiveness, and challenges in the Indo-Pacific demand clear-eyed leadership and a commitment to our alliances. Yet rather than reaffirming America's leadership, this administration has actively undermined our allies, cast doubt on our commitments to NATO, and most disturbingly, cozied up to the authoritarian adversaries like Russia. The credibility of the United States as a reliable partner has been called into question by our very own actions. Our president has refused to acknowledge the reality that Russia's unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine has shattered global security norms, and our recent gesture of support towards Russia are emboldening our adversaries. Mr. Colby, can you tell me if Russia invaded Ukraine?
Senator, as I said earlier, I don't want to disrupt anything going on with commentary on a fraught matter at a very delicate time. I'm really committed to making sure whatever I can do or not do anything that would hinder the ability to get a peace process on track.
Why does acknowledging whether or not Russia invaded Ukraine, which is a known fact, affect the peace process?
I think the president and the vice president made clear that words matter, that in these times of delicate diplomatic negotiations along the lines, I think, of what Senator Kramer was saying, it's not my place. I'm here as a nominee. I'm not part of the conversation. I wouldn't want to do anything to weigh in on this, especially at this very sensitive time where, Senator, I hope things do get back on track where we can have moves towards peace. And I don't think it's my place. I'm not authorized to speak on this matter as a representative of the government. I'm a nominee here.
It's astounding to me that you can't answer the question of whether or not Russia invaded Ukraine when it's a known fact. That would be as if saying you don't know whether or not Hitler invaded Poland. It is astounding to me that you cannot answer that question. After last Friday's shameful display in the Oval Office, it's clear that Trump is in the middle of a capitulation, not a negotiation. The wholesale refusal of this administration's officials and nominees to acknowledge the established fact of Russia's illegal and immoral full-scale invasion of Ukraine out of fealty to Trump and ultimately Vladimir Putin is one of the most shocking and disturbing things I've seen in my life. Mr. Colby, let's move on. Mr. Colby, you've been a vocal advocate of prioritizing the PRC as our greatest geopolitical challenge, and we had a very good conversation about this. I look forward to working with you on opposing our near-peer adversary. Often arguing that our strategic focus should shift away from other regions, and you've said, sometimes we need to shift from Europe and the Middle East and really focus on the Indo-Pacific. Under this administration, we have seen a surge in deployment of active duty U.S. military personnel to the southern border and Guantanamo Bay, not to counter an active military threat, but instead to perform law enforcement and accomplish logistical tasks that are typically handled by civilian agencies. Mr. Colby, given your stated concerns about the need to strengthen deterrence against the Communist Republic of China, do you believe diverting military assets to perform domestic political theater at the border is an effective use of our limited defense resources? Or is it a distraction from the real threats that we face?
Well, Senator, I wouldn't regard it as domestic political theater to secure our border and to make sure that we have territorial integrity. But if confirmed, I would certainly make it a real priority to make sure that those rightful efforts to ensure our territorial integrity and secure our border don't detract from our prioritizing the China threat, which is the biggest kind of external, state threat that we face as a country.
It's good to hear that. Thank you, Mr. Colby.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
I think that was a very helpful answer, Mr. Colby. Senator Budd.
Thank you, Chairman. Bridge, great to see you. Congrats on your nomination. Great to see your family here as well. So if confirmed, your influence on the national defense strategy and planning guidance will shape the department for years to come. So in the past, I've highlighted through Section 908 of the 2025 NDAA the importance of special operations forces and the need for those strategic documents to better reflect how the unique size, structure, and posture of special operations forces enables them to both serve as a preventer of conflict and, if God forbid there is a conflict, an enabler of it. So how does SOF, or how does Special Operations Forces fit into your vision for our national defense strategy?
Thank you very much, Senator Budd. I do think the Special Operations Forces play a very important role, not only in the prevention of conflict. Obviously, there's a lot of things they can do, building partner capacity, counterterrorism, and so forth. But also, God forbid, in the event of a major power war, SOF has multiple roles. It also is a way, apropos of the discussion with Senator King, to keep an eye on the ongoing terrorism threat. So I think SOF plays a very important role in our overall military posture.
Thank you for that. So how does irregular warfare fit into the strategy of denial in context of China or other adversaries?
Thanks, Senator. That's, as discussed in my responses to the advanced policy questions, that's something I have some sort of broad thoughts about the ability to, create dilemmas for China in the event of conflict or before conflict to deter it along, say, some of the secondary angles for China, as well as building partner capacity and the potential, again, God forbid, in the event of conflict to create difficulties and dilemmas for China directly in a military sense as well. So I think those are some of the areas. That's an area I'd want to dive deeper into to give you a more informed answer if confirmed.
In strategy of denial, I know that's come up a lot today, and thanks again for the copy. It was one of the first meetings I had in that early basement office in the Senate when you came and saw me a few years ago. But you talk about the importance of coalitions and maintaining a regional balance of power. So if a coalition's too small, it lacks influence. If it's too big, it may lack commitment from the members. So what does an optimal coalition look like to maintain the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. You're very kind. And that's something, as you may recall, I discussed in my book a lot. I think we actually are in pretty good shape in terms of the formal security commitments. I mean, apropos of my discussion with Senator Cotton, I think, and the chairman as well. We have very strong alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. I think we have effectively a very strong security relationship with Taiwan. Of course, Australia is very strong. And then I think we have a very deepening and important relationship with India that's directly proximate. I think we also could build effectively on a partnership with Vietnam. Obviously, we have a long and kind of fraught history with Vietnam, but the Vietnamese, say what you will, they're committed to defending themselves, and they see, I think, the challenge from China. So I think those are some of the places where we can work. I think if we can kind of hold the line at that way, that's would be an effective model going forward. And then, of course, there are ways at the diplomatic level and political level to use mechanisms like the Quad to build on that. But from a defense point of view, I think the defense perimeter along the first island chain is the one that makes the most sense.
Thank you. So given China's coercive activities in the Indo-Pacific, do you see any states hedging, and what can we do to minimize those states' concern about the U.S. commitment to regional stability and security?
Well, I think that's a really important question. I think in a sense you see hedging behavior all the time. You see balancing behavior by countries, take Taiwan or Japan, for instance. Japan is, albeit far too slowly, increasing its defense level of effort. It needs to go a lot farther, a lot faster. But you also see some hedging behavior. You see, engagement with Beijing. And I think all of the countries are kind of, continually reevaluating. I think the most important thing that we can do is have credible, capable military forces that are in the right place at the right time, to my discussion with Senator Sullivan, to be able to defeat sustained and effective Chinese aggression against a country within our security perimeter.
So what are your thoughts on a NATO-like alliance in the Indo-Pacific?
I'm not theologically opposed to it, Senator, but I've been skeptical. I was in Korea earlier last year, and there's the trilateral with the United States, Japan, and Korea. I think that's encouraging in some ways, but if we look at South Korean political dynamics over the last 6 to 8 months, it's not clear that that's going to be enduring. And so I think there's a lot of spade work and political capital that's put into a multilateral organization, whereas I think something may be building up to have more multilateralization in the region, but not the huge ambition of an Asian NATO, especially because you've got Japan over here, India over here, Australia down here. Their circumstances are quite distinct.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Budd. Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Colby, for meeting with me earlier and for your willingness to serve. Before I begin my questions, I want to add my voice to those of my colleagues to express my deep frustration with Friday's shameful Oval Office performance, followed by the President's decision last night to halt the delivery of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine in their fight for their country against a brutal dictator's invasion. I cannot believe that the United States would side with dictators over democracies, over our democratic partners and allies. We must stand with Ukraine. With that, I'm going to move on to a different part of the world, Iran, because we have to combat Iranian aggression. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. It remains the primary source of instability in the Middle East. It endangers the world through its support of proxies and its pursuit of developing a nuclear weapon. We know Hamas would not have been able to carry out the October 7th terrorist attack in Israel without Iranian support. We know this to be true. Across the region, Iran also continues to work against American interests and poses one of the greatest threats to U.S. military personnel and those of our allies and partners. So, Mr. Colby, like many of my colleagues, I worry that limiting U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, which you've advocated for in the past, could only allow Iran to further grow its influence in the region. And so what are the risks to U.S. national security and the security of the broader region if Iran continues, as you may have advocated in the past, to expand its reach unchecked? If we take our eye off Iran, what happens?
Well, thanks, Senator. Just to be clear, I've always opposed Iran's hegemonic ambitions, and I think to the contrary, my view has been how can we handle this situation, again, if I could stress, from the realistic predicate of where our military is now. And if you look at the 2022 national...
So let me take you at that, because over the last year, Iran has escalated targeting U.S. vessels, personnel in the Gulf of Aden via the Houthis. Iran's proxies, they've targeted U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria via its proxies for many years. So how are we going to address the ongoing threat?
Well, I don't contest that Iran is a threat or a malign regime in the slightest. I fully agree with you about that. I think the intelligent application of our own capabilities in the region, but also using and bolstering the capabilities of our allies, especially our key ally Israel, but also others in the region. We spoke with Senator Ernst about the Abraham Accords model, the ability to bolster some of the Arab states and other European partners that may have an important interest, that this can be a broader thing. And of course, Israel, to its credit, has significantly degraded Hezbollah's capability, of course, Hamas' capability, but also Iran's capability directly. So my view, Senator, just to be very clear, is not that we should ignore the Middle East or that we should totally get out of the Middle East. I'm baselining off the reality that I think all of us, candidly, must baseline off of, which is that we don't have a multi-war military. And you mentioned some of the things that the Iranians have been doing. Well, Admiral Paparo said the other day that the Chinese are now basically in the business of conducting rehearsals, not even exercises. And Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force, said a couple months ago, at the Biden administration, Secretary of the Air Force, he said not only are the Chinese on track to get ready by 2027, but the PLA will say it's ready by 2027.
Let's talk about China, because I want to learn about China's lessons from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
China's been identified, of course, as you say, the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense across both the Trump and the Biden administrations. As Ranking Member Reed has quoted former CIA Director Burns, no one is watching U.S. support for Ukraine more closely than Chinese leaders, and that abandoning Ukraine, I'm going to quote again, would be one of the surest ways to rekindle Chinese perceptions of America's fecklessness and stoke Chinese aggressiveness. So, Mr. Colby, after Friday's shameful performance in the Oval Office, what message did President Trump and Vice President Vance send to China regarding American resolve to back democracies against brutal dictators? And how does taking our eye off the ball anywhere make us any less safe?
Well, Senator Rosen, I'd point out that Director Burns, who's a distinguished foreign policy professional, has also said repeatedly that China was continuing to plan to move towards the 2027, and that Xi Jinping did have the intent to ultimately resolve the issue. So, Director Burns is obviously a foreign policy expert of great distinction, but if you look at what he himself has said—
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think that China China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are working in concert against us to present this multilateral challenge against us so that we won't fight back. So how do you justify taking your eye off,
Senator,
taking our eye off the ball anywhere?
It's arithmetic with respect, Senator.
Right. First of all, your answer to that question was yes, and now you're elaborating on that answer.
Yes, Senator.
Again, I hear much slower than you two talk.
My apologies. Would you like me to continue, Senator?
Yes, if you would elaborate on your affirmative answer to that question.
Yes, Senator, I do believe there's a counter coalition that is working as active, and I know the Chairman, you talked about this extensively, but again, the factual predicate that I think we all must proceed from is that, as the 2022 National Defense Strategy said, we have a one-war military in change. We don't have a military that's capable of fighting four adversaries at the same time. I would like, in theory, in principle, to have such a, but that's not the reality. I believe, especially because the threat is so acute and so realistic, and because of the very real possibility of multi-front war, we must have a realistic plan, and I feel a special obligation that, if confirmed, I must deliver a strategy that actually deals with that. That's not neglecting the Iran threat. That's not neglecting the military threat that Russia poses, but it is a realistic plan to deal with that. And part of that, of course, is greater defense investment and revitalization of our defense industrial base, but it's also making intelligent use of our allies, and in particular, in the case of Europe and countries like Japan and Taiwan, pressing them to take greater responsibility, which they can and must do.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that elaboration, which allowed us which required us to take a little extra time. And Mr. Colby, I think you'll acknowledge that is precisely the situation that my Peace Through Strength plan attempts to address beginning right now.
Senator, absolutely. I've had the pleasure of reviewing it, and I think we're keying off exactly, and you know, big supporter of that kind of perspective of restoring American strength, defense, industrial might, and getting our allies to do more, which it seems to me is also the perspective of the President and the Secretary of Defense.
Thank you. And Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to give you more of an opportunity to elaborate as a fellow realist. I think that there are a lot of hard truths that need to be told. The fact is, we can't be everywhere all at once all the time. That's the truth. And so whether it's this Jacksonian or Jeffersonian or prioritizer or realist, whatever you want to call it, I think that this town has been in denial for a very long time about a very fundamental issue of scarcity, right? And so we have to make decisions. Protecting the homeland, focusing on China, those are our top two priorities. There isn't to say there aren't other things that are of concern, but our industrial base has been strained to a point that it's not been, which is why there's really no daylight on this committee about sort of trying to reinvigorate that industrial base. But I think this Wilsonian adventurism that's defined post-Cold War foreign policy has been a huge distraction about what our core national interests are. And so you've been a leading advocate on that. But I want to give you an opportunity to sort of expound on that. What does, in your role, hopefully your new role here, could you elaborate on what that prioritization, how that would play out, how you think about these things? Because the truth is, if you have a strained industrial base, if you're building things for a land war in Europe, you might be neglecting long-range fires in the Indo-Pacific, right? So how do you view all this?
Well, thanks very much, Senator, and obviously really an honored and very similar perspective as yours. And I would say that I think, and I talked about this in my responses to my advanced policy questions, this so-called Lippmann gap, named after the famous journalist Walter Lippmann, who talked about, the danger of a gap between what you're aspiring to do and what you actually can do. And if you get that bluff called, that's catastrophe. And I feel, again, and forgive me for getting a little emotional about it, but I feel we are at the precipice. I think the President is exactly right, and Mr. Chairman, I think you're absolutely right, that we could be at the precipice not only of a major war, God forbid, with China itself, but by deduction of a multi-front war, and we do not have the capacity. And I don't luxuriate in that limitation. I would like to get, as you say, Senator, to a position, and we've spent a lot of time in this hearing, and I spent a lot of time saying, let's do the things necessary, Mr. Chairman, as you've talked about, to get us out of the situation, not only for our own forces, but to supply our allies. But what I've found a difficult challenge is I feel there's a kind of recognition in one part of the collective brain of the American system that this is a reality, but the behavior hasn't actually adapted yet. And what I fear is if we don't have a realistic plan, that the worst could happen and we could find ourselves in the worst possible outcome, like losing a war. And that's why I mentioned it in my opening statement, because I think, God forbid, that is actually plausible. And I want to avoid that at all costs. And by the way, I also don't want to abandon the Middle East. I don't want a nuclear Iran. I don't want Russia to run roughshod over Europe. I don't want North Korea to take over South Korea. But if we know, as a factual, empirical matter, that we can't do all those things in even remotely concurrent timelines, don't we need to have a credible plan for how to do so? And I think part of that is greater resources, Mr. Chairman, as you've advocated for, and I think that, in the reconciliation, hopefully that will be part of that reindustrialization, but also the secret sauce, I think, Senator Sullivan, as you were saying, is our allies, and they can do more, and they have done more. I mean, Japan is an incredibly wealthy economy. I mean, Taiwan, look at the investments the president got for TSMC yesterday. These are incredibly wealthy societies. Why are they not spending at levels commensurate with the threat? I don't understand.
Well, and that level of, and the type of spending matters too, right? When our European allies talk about stepping up, it can't be for pensions.
Right, exactly.
In tough talk and percentages of increase for GDP don't win wars. Weapons do.
Precisely.
And the deindustrialization that's happened in Europe, and most recently in Germany, has completely kneecapped their ability to be a serious player on this, which is concerning to me. I know it's concerning to you, right? And so as it relates to the industrial base then, and we had Mr. Feinberg here last week. I think that's a really important confirmation. I think yours is as well. How do you see working together with him? Because I agree, I'm fully supportive of the chairman's initiative for the plussing up and peace through strength. But practically speaking, then, how do we get to a place where we're more nimble? How do we get to a place, what are your views on this as far as procurement goes? I know it's not specifically your job, but it's related. It undergirds all of this, right, up for us to be able to do it.
Well, thank you, Senator. And I think actually the complementarity, I've spent some time with Mr. Feinberg, and I think we have a very natural complementarity. As I understand it, he's really presented himself more as kind of the COO of the department to get better results, and I'm more the policy and strategy guy. And I think that's a very natural complementarity where there's obviously different expertise, different experiences. So I would really welcome working with him. And then, of course, the secretary has his own set of extraordinary, I would not say that mine are extraordinary, but his set of extraordinary background and experiences and expertise. So I think, to me, I would, if confirmed, I would be very excited to work as part of that team that I think has a natural complementarity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Senator Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colby, since we've started this hearing, a lot of things have happened. I don't know if you're not in a position to follow the news. It's laughable to me to hear the Democrats call the meeting in the Oval Office on Friday shameful. And I know I had to step out and go to a Veterans Committee hearing. I had to go vote. But I'm sure I missed a lot of the rhetoric from my Democrat colleagues about the terrible, shameful meeting in the Oval Office on Friday. You might not be aware that 1 hour ago, President Zelensky tweeted. He called the meeting on Friday regrettable. He said Ukraine wants peace, not forever wars. He thanked President Trump and America for our support, even for the javelins that President Trump provided in the first Trump term that kept Ukraine on its feet. But here's the kicker. President Zelensky now said 1 hour ago he's ready to come back to America and sign the peace deal, the minerals deal. Is it possible here that President Trump's unconventional approach is actually very effective?
Yes, absolutely. I think the proof is in the pudding, and I think that's a really encouraging thing to say. I'm delighted to hear the news that we're making progress, obviously, knock on wood. I also think it shows that, trusting President Trump with these and his kind of particular deputies with this kind of high-level diplomacy is really important. It's not for me as a nominee to be spouting off and potentially interrupting this kind of progress. It's very encouraging. I know I speak for myself, but I'm pretty confident I know very confident you too. You want peace there. You want the Europe and the Ukraine to be in as good a position as they possibly can be. So that's very encouraging news.
It seems like a pattern though with President Trump.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he's
it's Iran. It's our other enemies abroad. It's the tariff approach. It seems like President Trump's unconventional approach is actually very effective.
I think it's very effective, and I think there's a degree, I mean, he's a master negotiator, he's a deal maker, he understands leverage, and he is not going to be calculable. I think one of the main critiques I think we probably all have of the last administration was that they were highly calculable and you could kind of measure it. And so the Russians could kind of precisely calibrate it. And after 3 years, almost 3 years of conflict, things were going worse. And I think with President Trump, you have a very different dynamic. You don't know what he's going to do, but you can get a deal with him. And this is, I think, the point about not, having ad hominems is an important part. It's not, I don't think he misunderstands who Vladimir Putin is, to the contrary, but I think he understands as part of a deal, a good deal, a verifiable deal, a positive deal. And the same logic would go with Iran if, and God willing, he's able to achieve that as well, or make progress in that direction as well. That would be the same approach I think he'd take.
I totally agree. I want to move on. Last year, INDOPACOM admitted to Congress that it had the most unfunded priorities in its history, $11 billion. One of INDOPACOM's biggest shortfalls was missile defense. At the same time, we've been giving Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine. We fired off hundreds of million-dollar missiles shooting down $1,000 Houthi drones. How wise is it to burn through our missile defense stocks in less important parts of the world when INDOPACOM is so desperately short of those weapons?
Well, I think, Senator, thanks. This is exactly the problem I'm pointing to. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing anything in Europe or the Middle East. To the contrary, but it's to say if we all agree that China is the top challenge and China is the most formidable threat, we need to act like it, because especially given what Admiral Paparo and others are saying, and Bill Burns has been saying, that we need to act like this could actually happen. I agree with Secretary Rubio. There is a very real threat under President Trump's, in the term that he's been elected to, given the 2027 date, that God forbid a war could happen. And I agree that President Trump has said that China would not attack Taiwan under his watch. And if confirmed, I would make it my business, my particular business, to give him the military strength to back that up, coupled with the negotiating ability, Senator, that you just referred to.
Yeah, on that note, our Navy's not as big as it needs to be. We especially don't have enough Navy ships in the Pacific to counter China's rapidly growing fleet. Despite that, President Biden decided to permanently deploy more Navy ships in Europe to counter Russia, a nation which lost most of its Black Sea fleet to a country without a Navy. Mr. Colby, should we be putting more vessels in Europe when we already don't have enough in the Pacific?
Senator, I think we should be putting the military capabilities, especially that are relevant in the priority area, ships, submarines, missile defense assets, have to be focused on deterring a conflict over Taiwan. And if, God forbid, it happens, giving our soldiers and sailors and airmen and defenders and Marines the best shot. I mean, that's something I feel very deeply is I'm not in uniform, but if confirmed, it would be my job to make sure those who are in uniform or who do stand in harm's way, the best shot at winning, because the American military shouldn't get in a fair fight.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I thank you, Senator Banks, for mentioning the really encouraging developments that have taken place since this hearing began. I'm going to take the liberty of reading into the record the exact statement of President Zelensky today. And I quote, "I would like to reiterate Ukraine's commitment to peace. None of us wants an endless war. Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We are ready to work fast to end the war, and the first stages could be the release of prisoners and truce in the sky. Could be. Ban on missiles, long-range drones, bombs on energy and other civilian infrastructure, and truce in the sea immediately if Russia will do the same. Then we want to move very fast through all the stages and to work with the U.S. to agree on a strong final deal. We really do value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. And we remember the moment when things changed, when President Trump provided Ukraine with javelins. We are grateful for this. Our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It is time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time in any convenient format. We see this agreement as a step toward greater security and solid security guarantees, and I truly hope it will work effectively." End of quote. And I would then remind those within the sound of my voice and those reading the record that our president, President Trump, has said the government of the United States of America supports Ukraine's efforts to obtain security guarantees needed to establish lasting peace. And to end the quote, and so let me just say this. I probably will not have an opportunity to take to the floor today, but I hope this is a day when we can refrain from some of the rhetoric that it's tempting to make. I hope this is a day when senators and members of the House of Representatives can take a deep breath and hope that the excellent, hopeful signs that come from this statement by President Zelensky come to fruition and come to fruition quickly. I've had fights with my roommates over time. We got over it. I'm even told sometimes there are family fights. It's regrettable when they spill out into the front yard. But friends get over it. Friends decide to move on. And I think we're seeing that process today. I hope to heaven that that is the case. And since Senator Banks mentioned it, I took the liberty of bringing it to the attention and to the record. Now, Mr. Colby, Senator Sullivan wants to question you for another half an hour. And no, Senator Sullivan has a question or two to tie down, if you don't mind. And I realize this has been a long hearing for you and your family. Senator Sullivan.
Mr. Colby, I wanted to make sure when you tell your kids that you went through this confirmation hearing that you said that it went through 2 rounds of tough questioning. So this is the second round. So thank you for, Mr. Chairman, indulging me. I think you're doing a great job right now. You're answering a lot of questions. Very quickly, the Wicker plan that you've reviewed is outstanding, and I'm not just saying that because that's our chairman. You're hearing Senator Banks and Senator Schmidt, many of us, Democrats as well, like that. Can you commit to work with this committee on getting to those kind of levels, the 3 to 5% of GDP that he puts forward? It's an excellent plan on shipbuilding, on industrial base, all the things we've talked about. I know that you got to go through the process, but just to fight for that. You might lose, but you know, we hear about 8% cuts. I've talked to Secretary Hegseth. That is not what he's planning. But we want to hear from the Pentagon officials that they will fight for this, because a lot of these choices that we're having to make, you're eloquently talking about, they become less difficult if we have a stronger industrial base and stronger military.
Yes, Senator, I commit to advocating for the higher defense levels that I think are consistent with what our security dictates. Of course, what exactly that would be, I can't say, both because I don't know, but also it wouldn't ultimately be up to me. But I think we're in a situation where more robust levels of defense spending are clearly in order.
Good. Let me go back to Taiwan very briefly. I would agree, and you talked about it earlier, it's the KMT, and it is the KMT, by the way. They control the legislature. It's different from the president's party. They're playing a dangerous game on their defense budget. And we all, if anyone from Taiwan is watching this hearing, they need to be, they need to realize they're playing a dangerous game, okay? Cutting defense spending right now is not the right signal. We all agree with that. As you know, the Taiwan Relations Act requires the U.S. to make weapons available to Taiwan for its defense. Every administration since 1979 has pledged to abide by that, and has. The Trump administration did a great job its first term. If confirmed, will you work with us to make sure we're going to turn the Taiwanese around, but that we will commit to work with Taiwan and us to comply with the Taiwan Relations Act?
Yes, certainly, Senator, and even more than that, I would make it a special focus to accelerate and revamp and focus those capabilities and expand them, those weapons transfers and sales and so forth, to assist Taiwan in its ability to defend itself. So I've mentioned the pressure that we need to put on Taiwan. I think you're absolutely right, Senator, but we also need to do our part on the U.S. side to make real capabilities available in a timely fashion, which we've not done a good job on.
Get those weapons out there. I met with the previous president. She had a great statement to me when I talked about will, and she said, will is often a function of training and capability. If you're stronger and you have weapons, we have this giant backlog, for example, of harpoons that we should be getting to the Taiwanese. So I think that's an important point that she made. Will is a function.
You have a final question.
The final question is the most important of the whole hearing. We're talking about protecting the homeland. A lot of focus on the southern border, not always a ton of focus on the northern border. My part of the world, Alaska, the Arctic, the North Pacific. But I'm sure you've noticed, Mr. Colby, in the last couple years, we've had a huge increase in the incursions of Russian ships, Russian Bear bombers, Chinese strategic bombers doing joint patrols with Russians, joint naval task force, all in the ADIZ and the EEZ of America, in the Arctic, in the North Pacific. President Trump, after he got elected, said we'll, quote, ensure Alaska gets even more defense investment as we fully rebuild our military, especially as Russia and China are making menacing moves in the Pacific. This is just an example of how many. The NORTHCOM commander, the INDOPACOM commander recently testified that they think they're going to see even more of that. We had 2 Bear bomber incursions in 48 hours and 2 weeks ago. Both NORTHCOM and INDOPACOM commander said it's time to they committed to reopening the Navy base here at ADAC, which is a very strategic base. I'd like your commitment to come to Alaska, come to me, come up there with me, see all our great military up there, and work with me on strengthening our northern border, in particular issues like infrastructure at ADAC, which will provide our forces the ability to respond to the attack on the northern border, which doesn't get a lot of press.
Well, Senator, you're preaching to the choir on this, and it'd be a privilege to come visit Alaska with you, and I'd be honored to do it.
Great.
If confirmed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Colby.
Thank
Good
you,
job.
Senator Sullivan. And I would point out, Mr. Colby, that it's cold up there, even in the summertime. So bring your long johns. This is one of the papers that I have produced. It's the second one, Restoring Freedom's Forge. I hope you will agree that the best way to begin immediately getting enough submarines to have in the Pacific and doing so efficiently and using more modern techniques is to explore this very type of innovation.
I do agree, Senator. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This concludes today's hearing. I'd like to thank our witness for his testimony, and thanks to the family. The restrooms are right down the hall. For the information of members, questions for the record will be due to the committee within 2 business days at the conclusion of the hearing. We are adjourned.